Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic is considered one of the greatest games of all time, and if you haven't played it already, you probably never will. Knights of the Old Republic, or KOTOR for short, turns 20 years old in 2023, but its significance has never been more relevant. Star Wars is looking for new ways to expand its brand, and a lot of gamers reflect fondly on the mid-2000s when games like KOTOR were more common. When I heard Sony was funding a remake of Knights of the Old Republic, it made sense. It is a hyper-popular game, remakes are on trend for the video game industry, and KOTOR is one of the few Star Wars properties that people still enjoy without reservation. Unfortunately, at the time of this video, it seems the remake will never be released. We haven't gotten a real update about the remake since its announcement, and there are rumors it has been quietly canceled.
I still think Prince of Persia comes out, though, before KOTOR, which I don't think will ever come out.
This is a real tragedy because KOTOR is one of my favorite games of all time, but I can't get any of my friends to play it. Originally developed for the Xbox in 2003, Knights of the Old Republic can be difficult to go back to for modern audiences. It was ported to the PC and remains available on platforms like Steam, but getting it to run can require a little more troubleshooting than downloading it and pressing play. Getting it to play in modern resolutions is even more difficult. This is without acknowledging, even if you get the game to work, the janky mechanics and old-school game design can be isolating to new players. Not to mention, it's a Star Wars game where you don't see a lightsaber for several hours. All of this means when I recommend someone plays Knights of the Old Republic, they never do. This is why, after years of considering such a project, I've decided to make this video series. I left my job in May earlier this year, and my circumstances allowed for me to dedicate my work to something I was really passionate about. I've had a long history with Knights of the Old Republic. I've played it more than a dozen times over the past 20 years. Despite never considering myself a Star Wars fan, I found myself returning to this game because it has remained so timeless and relevant. It is a perfect fantasy science fiction story, and I genuinely love it more than any of the Star Wars films. It's a game more people should experience. If that can't be accomplished with a remake, then I'll do what I can with this video series. If you've never played Knights of the Old Republic, this is the video for you. I've written this video to act as a kind of virtual tourism of a game you've never played. I'll assume you know nothing about the game. There are clear chapter titles throughout the series. Anything that happens in the game within that chapter will be referenced without warning, but I won't be talking about future events or other planets unless they've already occurred in the sequence of the video. With all that said, and I really cannot emphasize this enough, Knights of the Old Republic was created as a video game you are meant to play. This is a role-playing game where the player defines their relationship with their character, their party members, events in the story, and the universe of Star Wars. Your experience playing the game will be different from watching this video. Watching this video will never be as good as playing the game yourself. I strongly encourage you to give it a shot. As exhaustive as this video series might appear, I guarantee you there are quests and content I haven't covered, and I've done that intentionally so that even if you like this video series, there's still something for you to get out of playing the game. Also, despite what I said a moment ago, I don't find the mechanics of KOTOR to be all that isolating. It's not like you're playing the original XCOM or some other game where if you don't have the manual, you're completely lost. I'll share some tips so you can get through some of the more inaccessible parts of the game, but generally, I think if you have a genuine interest in this game, you can easily play through it. If you're already a fan of Knights of the Old Republic, I've also included personal analysis on what makes the game so good. These insights are aided by polling data of KOTOR fans, information shared in articles and books about the production history, and contributing my own thoughts as a lifelong fan of video games. I'm not a designer or an active journalist of any kind, I just really like Knights of the Old Republic. With this in mind, I invite you to correct me on information I've gotten wrong or misunderstood. KOTOR is a complex game in a complex genre with a brand that has a lot of diehard fans. It is certain I will miss something. I was tempted to begin this video with the fascinating production history of Knights of the Old Republic, but I've decided to weave those stories into the video rather than front-load it here. After all, this is about the game itself, not how it was made. So let's begin. When you start Knights of the Old Republic for the first time, you'll see its roots as a Western computer role-playing game, or CRPG. Once you hit New Game, you're dumped into a dense character creator menu. You're forced to make decisions on things like attributes, feats, and skills without knowing what any of these things do. Since this era of gaming, there have been innovations in onboarding the player into a mechanically dense world. For example, The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion gives players control of a character immediately, and they play through an extended tutorial sequence where they learn key concepts before they commit to a playstyle. KOTOR has a similar prologue sequence to familiarize you with the mechanics, but it happens after the character creation screen. Granted, the tutorial isn't very long, so you could easily restart with a new character within 10 to 20 minutes, but most players find restarting a demoralizing setback. This is a problem because it's not impossible to make a subpar character if you don't know what any of the systems do. If you're reading description text on attributes, you may get an impression of the game that is not accurate. You may make a character build that isn't ideal for the minute-to-minute gameplay loop. If you're trying to make your own character while following this video, I could easily sit here and explain every system to you right now, but without more context, the explanations are boring. The shortest explanation is to say Knights of the Old Republic uses an identical system to the Dungeons & Dragons Roll20 system. If that means something to you, then you have a pretty good understanding of KOTOR's mechanics. If that last sentence was gibberish to you, then don't worry about it for now. You could select Quick Character, but personally I think the selections made by this option are pretty bad. I have my own personal recommendation for new players as someone who's played this game 20 times. The first thing you'll have to decide is a class between Soldier, Scout, and Scoundrel. This isn't a real decision because your class becomes irrelevant after the first part of the game. Your class will dictate your starting feats, your base vitality points, or what you may refer to as hit points, and which skills you're more proficient in. None of these things really matter at level 1. You can dramatically change your character as you gain subsequent levels, so I wouldn't worry about the class too much. I would recommend new players pick Soldier, but you can't go wrong with Scout either. Scoundrel can be a bit more difficult because you don't have as many vitality points, so I wouldn't recommend it on your first playthrough. Soldiers have more vitality points and more feats, but again, Scout is also fine. In terms of functional mechanics, the community consistently ranks all three classes in similar regard, although there is a slight edge for Soldier taken from Scoundrel's popularity. You can also decide if you want to be a male or female protagonist, and this will result in occasional differences in your character's experience. For example, this game was made with heteronormative assumptions, so romance options are locked to your character's sex. Next, you'll have to decide your character portrait. It has no mechanical importance, but you'll probably spend more time on this than any of the other character creation options. After looking at every single character portrait multiple times, you can select portrait number 14 because that's the one everyone picks. I can mention here, I recorded 3 playthroughs of this game. This portrait is the most popular male option, and this portrait is the most popular female option. Although it's worth mentioning, the female portrait options are more dispersed in terms of community preference. According to a survey done on the community, an overwhelming majority of players report their one and only playthrough of KOTOR followed a male light side protagonist. To reflect that popularity, whenever you see this guy in my footage, that's the path he's following. The female portrait is the dark side path. Finally, this guy is a novelty playthrough I used to pick all the unpopular options and builds, and if you see this lady, that means I forgot to record something 3 different times and I finally got it on the 4th playthrough. The first real decision you'll have to make are the values for 6 different attributes: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Once again, if you're familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, these attributes will be very familiar to you. I should probably mention here, a lot of KOTOR is based on Dungeons & Dragons, so I'm going to be referencing it quite frequently, but you don't need to understand D&D to understand Knights of the Old Republic or to enjoy this video. I can talk about what each of these attributes does later in the video, but for now, I would just recommend this build. With this build, you will be able to do pretty much anything in the game. Okay, it turns out having 8 intelligence is kind of a bad idea. You could take 2 points from dexterity or constitution, but I still think the build is fine. You just won't be able to persuade every person you meet in the first half of the game. Intelligence and wisdom aren't important for reasons that will become obvious later when we talk about these systems. Also, every instance of me saying later means the next video. I didn't get to it in this one, sorry. Which isn't to say that they have no value. This is just the build I would recommend for your first playthrough of the game. Next, you'll pick your skills. If you picked a soldier class with the previously referenced attributes, you won't have many points to allocate, which is fine. Most players want to max out Persuade, but for your first level, I'd recommend getting a single point in Security. Skills don't really matter at all, and they especially do not matter for the first few levels. Then you'll pick your feats. Feats are basically special abilities you can use in combat. Your class will start with some standard feats unlocked automatically. For example, Soldier starts with all the armor feats, so you can equip light, medium, and heavy armor from level 1. This is just one of the ways the Soldier class is more friendly to beginners. Scout and Scoundrel have additional class feats exclusive to their class. For example, Scoundrel has a class feat called Sneak Attack, which adds to your damage if you attack enemies from behind. Any class can can get any standard feat eventually, but class feats are exclusive to the corresponding class. For example, scoundrels can eventually level up all the armor feats a soldier starts with, but soldiers can never get sneak attack because it is a scoundrel class feat. You can read through all these feats and get whatever sounds cool, but I think maybe half of these feats are totally useless. If you don't know what to get, you can go with Flurry, which lets you attack multiple times in one round of combat, or you can get the first level of dual wielding, which is one of the most popular feats in the community. Finally, you choose your name. The random name generator has some believable Star Wars sounding names, but I usually input my own name or occasionally a Star Trek character if I feel like amusing myself. Speaking of amusing yourself, there is a long-running meme within the KOTOR community to name the player character after individuals who are alluded to in the story, but your character never actually confronts. For example, Exar Kun is a Dark Jedi that's popular in the lore and referenced a few times in KOTOR, but your character never actually meets them. As a result, a lot of people find it very funny to name their character Exar Kun. There are other popular examples of this, but mentioning them would be a bit of a spoiler. You should know, if you find yourself watching a KOTOR stream, you're almost certainly going to see someone doing this. Now you're in on the joke and have been warned. With your character made, you can begin the game. Knights of the Old Republic begins with the iconic introduction and opening crawl that precedes all major Star Wars films. This text establishes Darth Malak as the main antagonist and references he's the last surviving apprentice of Darth Revan. I've always liked the names of these antagonists. The root mal is a Latin word for bad or evil. It's used in words like malnourished or malevolent. On a similar note, native English speakers report the sounds produced by the letter R often produce the feeling of unease or distrust. Consider words like murder, reaper, or a name like Rory Gilmore. The names Malak and Revan tell you everything you need to know about these characters. It's good the names convey so much about these characters because despite being major characters in the plot, neither Malak nor Revan appear for the first 4 to 5 hours of the game. You can get some surface level details from optional dialogue, but generally the game doesn't try to get you invested in these guys because they're not immediately relevant to the first few hours of gameplay. The other key detail established in this text is where the game begins, in a space battle above a planet named Terrace. Your character is introduced waking up in a bunk while their ship is assaulted by the Sith fleet. Your first interaction with the game's mechanics is where the developer BioWare feels most at home, within the dialogue selection screen. You'll be confronted by a man who says his name is Trask Olgo, a colleague of yours on this ship called the Endar Spire.
We've been ambushed by a Sith battle fleet. The Endar Spire is under attack. Hurry up, we don't have much time.
Trask explains the ship's mission was to transport a powerful Jedi named Bastila so she can use an ability called Battle Meditation to swing the tides of the war against the Sith in the Republic's favor. The information Trask conveys is the bare essentials of the context you need to understand your situation, but the game is smart to assume you don't care to explore these details right now. A lot of RPGs make the faulty assumption new players want to dive right into the dense lore of the world. I think this is because when fans of the genre are asked what they like about their favorite RPGs, they usually say the story. In fact, a poll of fans of KOTOR showed the story is the most popular element of Knights of the Old Republic. This data can be misunderstood because it takes for granted a requirement for players' enjoyment of a story. Players like the stories of their favorite games because they feel invested in those stories. Investment happens when the player creates an emotional attachment to the characters or the world, and this investment is what registers an emotional response to the developments in the plot. Creating investment is a known necessity for crafting compelling stories. There's a reason books don't begin with an extended history of the main character's life. The reader needs to be invested in these details before they care. Anyone thinking of rewriting the Bible might want to start taking notes. Books and movies have their own way of creating investment for the audience. These two mediums typically accomplish this by making a character likable or relatable. These methods of storytelling have influenced many video games, and that makes sense. Movies and books were the dominant narrative art form for for centuries. But video games are different. Video games create investment differently. This might sound obvious, but the way people who play video games gain investment in the game is by playing the game. They develop investment through interacting with the game's mechanics. Thus, a player will become invested and form an emotional attachment to anything in a game that has a mechanical function. For example, the video game Portal has an object called the Companion Cube. This cube has no face, no personality, and the bare minimum of characterization. It has a heart graphic on its side, but that is its sole distinguishing element. The Companion Cube is not relatable or likable in the way these terms are used for other mediums. Despite this, the Companion Cube is a fan favorite character. It is often depicted in fan art and cosplay at video game conventions. The reason the Companion Cube is so popular is because it has a mechanical function in the game it appears in. The Companion Cube is used to solve puzzles throughout Portal, which means the entirety of the player's relationship is not through likability or relatability, it's through interacting with the mechanics. Now you might push back that the heart on the side is just enough to create likability in the Companion Cube, but there are more examples. For example, in The Last of Us, there is a mechanic where the player is given access to an object that can be thrown at enemies. This object can be a brick or a bottle found in the environment. Functionally, the bottle and the brick are exactly the same. Despite this, there is an intense, albeit tongue-in-cheek, rivalry within the Last of Us community between brick fans and bottle fans. The reason these items have created such passion is because they both serve a mechanical function. They are both used in high-stress situations to save the player character's life, and whether you experience that high-stress situation with a brick or a bottle probably dictates which one you like better. These mechanics became likable because how the player interacts with them. Knights of the Old Republic knows you need to interact with its mechanics to become invested in the game, to care about its story. The designers know you're not invested in a game you just started. You haven't played with the mechanics yet. This introduction with Trask doesn't even give you the option to slow down your experience by asking questions. Trask wants you to enjoy Knights of the Old Republic, so he wants you to get to the game. He knows you don't need to know how battle meditation works because his square jaw and crew cut is all the morale an army needs to succeed. He also knows you don't need to know what your job is on the Endar Spire because he probably covers for you all the time while you're off replaying other B-tier BioWare games like Jade Empire. Trask knows what's best. He's looking out for you by skipping the exposition and getting you to the game. Once you're done wasting Trask's time, he'll direct you to get your gear and then introduce you to the 3 core mechanics that make up Knights of the Old Republic's gameplay. Each mechanic is tied to one of the 3 consecutive challenges you're about to resolve. You'll have to get through a security clearance door, unlock a second door, and then confront a group of Sith soldiers. The first door introduces the mechanic and concept of party members. Your player character can't open the door because Trask explains you don't have the required security clearance. Only Trask can open the door. Now, this isn't a difficult challenge. You just simply switch control to Trask and presto, the door is open. You might wonder, what was the point of designing this trivial obstacle for the very beginning of the game? It's to convey to the player a vital concept. Your party members and their place in the world matter. Knights of the Old Republic isn't one of those games where you're the main character who does everything. Your party is more than additional damage per second during combat. These characters have backstories, skills, and relationships separate from your character. Sometimes you have the good fortune of being paired with a total alpha male like Trask. I mean, he's got security clearance, and without him, you'd be some dweeb locked in this room forever while the ship blows up. You basically owe him your life. Who you choose to bring with you on your adventure makes a tangible impact on your experience with the mechanics and the story. For example, you've now learned Trask has Republic security clearance. Maybe later in the game, you'll enter Republic-controlled territory. That could be a good time to bring Trask with you. Alternatively, if you're in an area with no Republic affiliation, maybe there's a better party member to bring with you instead of Trask. In fact, bringing Trask may be a liability because he would be recognized as a Republic soldier. But really, that's a problem for them. Trask doesn't have problems. He has solutions. Who's in your party is a decision that matters in this game. KOTOR wants to convey the importance of your party member's identity, and it does that within the very first room of the entire game. The next door also needs to be opened, but unlike the first door, this one is locked. Security clearance won't help you here. This is how the game introduces the concept of skills. When you made your character, you allocated points across a variety of skills, including computer use, demolitions, awareness, and etc. All of these skills correspond with some additional mechanic in the world to resolve challenges. In this instance, the door can be unlocked with any character with the prerequisite security skill. You may recall I recommended you give your character 1 point in security. If you didn't, then you're out of luck. Luckily for you, Trask also has enough security skill to unlock the door. Trask's usefulness here reinforces the lesson of the last tutorial challenge. Your player character may not have the skills you need to progress, but you can rely on your party members to fill in for you as needed. This is also why I said skills don't matter at all, at least not for your character. Any instance where there is a skill check in the game, you will have your party with you to unlock doors, hack computers, or repair droids. You don't need to do it yourself. The exception to this is persuasion skill checks, which can only be attempted by your player character. Party members and skills are important, but the last concept introduced in this sequence is overwhelmingly the most common and most important mechanic: combat. The world of Knights of the Old Republic may have many characters to meet, challenges to overcome, and places to explore, but more often than not, what you'll be doing in this game is fighting in combat. Knights of the Old Republic's focus on combat was a departure from BioWare's past work and other CRPGs released at the time. Games like Baldur's Gate, or the original Fallout games, allow for playstyles like pacifist runs, or a character build oriented around charisma and persuasion. There are also other CRPGs like Vampire the Masquerade that allow for full stealth runs thanks to a pickable class that can't even be seen by NPCs without resulting in a game over. These playstyles are very popular with a passionate subset of the RPG fanbase, but they can be impractical to implement and inaccessible to inexperienced players. Knights of the Old Republic skill system suggests there are alternative playstyles, but really, there's not. Your character needs to be able to hit things real good and survive getting hit by other things. The focus on combat was an intentional decision by BioWare as a way to make the game more accessible to mass markets. They wanted new players who had never touched a video game to enjoy KOTOR as much as everyone else. It was a safe assumption most players would approach all potential foes as an enemy that could and should be attacked. This assumption is deeply ingrained in the design of the game. In fact, the tutorial doesn't even teach you about the sneak mechanic unless you're a scoundrel, but even then it's kind of worded as a suggestion. At no point does the game suggest you can complete it by sneaking and persuading your way to the end of the game. However, you may incorrectly come to that assumption if you built your character based off of reading the description text in the character creator. Personally, I'm very glad BioWare took a combat-focused approach for Knights of the Old Republic. I've been playing video games my entire life, and even I find earlier CRPGs to be completely inaccessible. I've tried Fallout, Baldur's Gate, Planescape Torment, and even newer versions of the same systems like Divinity Original Sin. These games simply have a radically different pace to their gameplay loops. If you're familiar with the CRPG loop, I imagine this unlocks the enjoyment you can have with them, but I personally have never felt engaged enough to make that commitment. Considering modern players already bounce off of KOTOR for being too inaccessible, I can only imagine how much worse it would be if BioWare had leaned harder into these alternative playstyles. I could talk at length about the combat system, but it doesn't matter right now. There isn't a genuine challenge in KOTOR's combat until the end of the prologue a few hours from now. If you picked the class, attributes, and feats I recommended, you can cruise through the tutorial and prologue without issue. In fact, this could be considered a flaw in KOTOR's design. You can get pretty far into the game with a bad build before hitting the mid-game difficulty cliff. But we'll talk about the mid-game difficulty cliff later. For now, the only thing you might want to remember is Knights of the Old Republic and its mechanics are heavily influenced by Dungeons & Dragons, the tabletop board game that was effectively the precursor to all RPG video games. I'll mention D&D a lot, but we don't need the details right now. The very first combat encounter of Knights of the Old Republic can be a little strange because it has swords. Not lightsabers or some energy weapon that's shaped like a sword. There's just straight up metal swords. The game will eventually explain in a few different places why anyone would use a sword in the Star Wars universe, but what you need to know is yes, swords are a viable weapon. In fact, they're significantly better than the alternative, blasters. If you picked a soldier, you can equip a sword and go to town on the Sith soldiers. If you're doing a weaker build, such as Scoundrel, then Trask is beefy enough to tank blows for you while you take pot shots with a blaster. There's even some lunatics that do blaster-only runs, but I'll talk about that a bit later. The game wants you to get familiar with the combat system, and it gives you a lot of pop-up tutorials to explain what the game is not. For example, a common misunderstanding for new players is assuming Knights of the Old Republic is an action game. New players often learn there's an attack button, then mash it over and over and over again, but that's not how KOTOR works. Knights of the Old Republic is a real-time, turn-based game. All combat is divided into combat rounds. Every character involved in combat decides what they want to do for the next round. Selecting attack communicates to the combat system you want to do a normal attack for the next round. Pressing the attack button multiple times in a row simply cues multiple subsequent rounds of your normal attack. There's actually a specific pop-up for telling players to stop mashing the attack button. You can see what actions you've lined up for upcoming rounds at the bottom of the screen. Attack is the most common action for your turn, but you can also use a combat feat, an item, and Jedi characters can use force powers. If you don't select anything, the game automatically makes your character do a regular attack. You can also pause the game and switch between characters to line up different actions. The turn-based system lets you coordinate across multiple party members, so it feels like you're controlling the entire party rather than a main character with some buddies who are doing their own thing. If you like the idea of your party members doing whatever they feel like, then you should check out this game called Persona 3. Mechanically, KOTOR is a turn-based game, but I think there is a reason why people assume it's an action game, and that's because the combat looks really cool. Every action in KOTOR's combat is accompanied by a unique animation. The turn-based system allows your party members and their combatants to sync together for believable interactions. Your characters don't merely swing generically at enemies who don't react at all to the metal sword colliding into their face. The weapons between foes actually make contact. You get to watch your party duel with their foes, and what happens in the animation changes based on if you land your attacks or not. This is also true for blaster animations, and there's even unique animations for your combat feats. These animations add to the role-playing element of the game. The combat of Knights of the Old Republic feels like a fight in the Star Wars universe. Seeing how your character fights in the world reinforces the role you're playing within the game. These animations have personality and are unique to the genre. Even BioWare's later games like Dragon Age didn't include these types of animations. No matter how many times I play KOTOR, I never tire of the combat because the spectacle of the animations immerses me in the world of Star Wars. Some new players are disappointed when they discover Knights of the Old Republic is turn-based, but I think this snap judgment is too harsh. Personally, I think people who play video games greatly undervalue how aesthetics contribute to an interactive experience. I've heard the refrain, gameplay over graphics, my entire life. But KOTOR, and RPGs in general, is great proof of how visual presentation can heighten the enjoyment of an otherwise less engaging mechanic. After the first room of combat, you'll come to a room with a Jedi battling a Sith in lightsaber combat. The Jedi will win this encounter, but then get blown up by an explosion. This is a good time to mention, I'll say whenever I think the remake could improve the game with a minor change. And I would personally cut this sequence. I understand it's here because without it, you wouldn't see a lightsaber in a Star Wars game for more than 4 hours into the game. But it is needlessly frustrating to present the player with a potential Jedi ally and not even get the chance to speak to them. It's also annoying you can loot their body, but the lightsaber just magically disappears. There's a better way to include Jedi earlier in the game, and I'll share my thoughts at the end of this chapter. Before the next room, Trask will prompt you to switch to a melee weapon if you're not already using one. This is the first spot where the game will explain the viability of swords against blasters and lightsabers. The in-universe explanation is these swords are coated with material that makes them energy resistant, so they won't melt if they hit a lightsaber or blaster fire. The practical explanation is BioWare wanted to populate the game with melee combatants, and this is an excuse to have that without giving every single enemy a lightsaber. You could nitpick about this, but I think this is one of those instances where I argue the player's experience is more important than the brand's lore. I don't think the lore explanation for the viability of swords is very convincing, but it doesn't matter because it serves the overall gameplay experience. I can forgive a lame explanation because it makes the experience better, but for some reason not everyone is willing to be so forgiving. Once you've dispatched the enemies on the bridge, your character will automatically level up. None of these decisions are super significant right now. If you've already selected the feat for dual wielding and flurry, then just take whatever sounds cool. After leveling up, you'll come face to face with a Sith. Typically, this would mean certain death and doom for any character that's not a Jedi, but you have a secret weapon. It's Giga Chad Trask Ulgo, who immediately throws himself at the Sith to allow for your escape. He even locks the door behind him, so you can't try to save him if you wanted to. Unfortunately for us, this is the end of Trask's time in your party. His removal through sacrifice reinforces the wisdom of two design decisions BioWare made in the first hour of Knights of the Old Republic. The first is choosing to create investment in the player through interacting with the game's mechanics. Trask is in the game for 20 minutes, and in that time, he is incredibly useful. He can open locked doors, he can shoot bad guys, and he can tank hits on the front line. He doesn't waste the player's time with needless exposition, and when a Dark Jedi appears, he doesn't hesitate in sacrificing himself for your benefit. Trask is a net positive on the player's experience, so perhaps unsurprisingly, the community has a strong affinity for him, even though he doesn't have much involvement in the story. Unless he's not really dead. The second point is BioWare's change to the inventory system. If you had played CRPGs your whole life, the change in inventory would have been obvious within the first 30 seconds of the game. For players unaware of the genre's history, it may not be obvious what a dramatic change BioWare made for this game. As I mentioned, RPG video games were heavily influenced by Dungeons & Dragons, and the earliest RPGs replicated the inventory system found in that tabletop game. In D&D, each character has their own inventory. This is because D&D is played entirely with real human beings. One player acts as the Dungeon Master, or DM, who is effectively the designer of the game. The DM controls all the enemies in combat, designs all the quests, speaks for all the NPCs, and does everything a video game accomplishes through its programming. Every other person sitting at the table who isn't the DM is a player who controls their own individual character. This character has their own attributes, backstory, motivations, and inventory. So if the tutorial of KOTOR was translated into a D&D tabletop, one player would be controlling all the Sith soldiers, one player would be playing Trask Ulgo, and another player would be your main character. Although obviously in the tabletop, the main character wouldn't be the main character, but just another member of the party. When video game developers started making games based off of D&D, it made sense to replicate the tabletop even when the experience of the video game was fundamentally different. So while a single-player RPG video game may only have one player controlling 4 characters, the designers chose to give each individual character their own inventory. This was true for BioWare's earlier games like Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights. But the experience is very different when you're playing tabletop Dungeons & Dragons versus a single-player video game with multiple characters. Applying the tabletop's design to Knights of the Old Republic would mean Trask's inventory is separate from your player character's inventory. But BioWare didn't design KOTOR in that way. Okay, so maybe you're wondering, why does this difference matter? Well, it's likely you equipped Trask with armor or a better weapon so he can be more useful in combat. If KOTOR was using the classic inventory system, then all the equipment you gave Trask would now be gone. The player has no way of knowing Trask sacrifices himself, and there's no way to influence his decision to do this. Unless you had played the game before, losing Trask's equipment would be experienced as a punishment on your lack of knowledge. This would be a perfect example of inaccessible game design. This is also why KOTOR doesn't use that system. In KOTOR, all of Trask's equipment is moved back into your general inventory before the cutscene of his sacrifice. There are some modern games that continue to use the classic D&D inventory system, such as Divinity Original Sin, and there is an argument for that design choice. People who prefer the older system argue it doesn't make any sense for the party to have an omnipresent inventory existing in the ether. It also robs the player of dramatic experiences, such as giving a high-value loot item to one specific character, which means if the character dies, that is a far more affecting experience than if all their loot magically transported back to your possession. The design and player preference around these systems is constantly evolving, but for BioWare, they were working with a mass-market intellectual property, so they chose to streamline the game as much as possible. I think this design decision is important to acknowledge because it communicates how one of the chief design goals of Knights of the Old Republic was to make it it accessible. This is a valuable point to establish because when discussing what should change in the remake, I think there is a strong argument for changing any mechanic that makes the game more accessible for modern players. After all, that's what KOTOR did compared to other games from its genre when it was released. I think the gameplay of KOTOR could be modified quite a bit, whereas other elements, such as the story or general quest design, are worth preserving. Anyway, in this instance, you get Trask's equipment because the alternative design would require the player having a premonition about Trask's sacrifice. Such as if he planned to be sacrificed. We didn't actually see him die, did we? The next sequence of the Endar Spire has the player on their own, which is unique because this is one of 4 times in the entire game where you have no party members to help you. Your character is alone, but they do receive guidance from a new character. Earlier in the tutorial, you received communication from a Republic soldier named Carth Onasi, but after Trask leaves your party, Carth will start communicating with you directly. He'll guide you through additional rooms of combat, and the tutorial will conclude with a reiteration of the concept of skill checks. Carth will explain the final room is filled with Sith soldiers, and you have access to 2 solutions that rely on skills. You can either use your repair skill to fit a droid with advanced combat tactics, or you can use your computer skill to sabotage equipment in the next room and kill everyone. Computer hacking requires computer spikes, and repair requires repair parts. Both of the necessary number of spikes and parts are available in the locker box located in the same room. The red guy will drop a prototype vibroblade, which is a pretty good weapon you'll likely use for yourself or one of your party members for the next several hours. After this room, you meet up with Carth and escape the Endar Spire as it blows up. This concludes the tutorial for Knights of the Old Republic. When the community is polled about their feelings about the Endar Spire, it tends to rank pretty low. Out of the 16 major sections of the game, this tutorial has the 6th highest disapproval rating and the lowest approval rating. Personally, I see this as a pretty good sign. Nobody likes tutorials, and the Endar Spire really isn't that bad. It takes less than 15 minutes to complete, which means playing it takes about half the amount of time as it took for you to listen to me talk about it. It's not overly hand-holding, and you get some okay loot along the way. All that said, I don't know how successful it is as a tutorial. It gives the false impression the skills are integral to the game, but they're not. Some of its other lessons aren't necessarily clear. For example, I don't think anyone considers the sequence where you see a grenade used is meant to prompt you to use your own grenades. I also think the prompt to switch to melee weapons in close quarters suggests the type of weapon you use is situational, but that's not true. You can use melee weapons or blasters the entire game. In fact, it may be more beneficial for the game to communicate melee weapons are generally better than blasters. These are all nitpicks, but I think there's enough to warrant a redesigned tutorial for the remake. Perhaps the most glaring faults of the tutorial is what it doesn't do, which is give players an impression of what Knights of the Old Republic will become. If there's anything I would change about the opening of Knights of the Old Republic, it would be to start the game with a classic abilities sequence. The game could begin with the player controlling Bastila, as she leads the mission immediately preceding the tutorial sequence. This would give the player immediate access to the most appealing part of KOTOR, playing as a Jedi. Bastila's mission is to confront Darth Malak and Darth Revan directly. This introductory sequence could conclude with the player's control switching from Bastila to Darth Revan in a kind of unwinnable boss fight. By the way, this isn't a spoiler because Carth is going to tell the player in the next few minutes that Bastila killed Darth Revan in this fight. This new tutorial sequence would give the player an immediate comparison between light side Jedi powers and dark side Sith powers. This opportunity to compare and contrast Jedi and Sith powers isn't available anywhere else in the game, short of replaying it multiple times. Playing as a Jedi and Sith character would give the player exposure to the crux of the game's appeal. It would also serve a significant narrative goal. In the game's current design, you're exposed to the names Bastila, Malak, and Revan, but you don't actually see what they look like until after the tutorial. The first thing that happens after the tutorial is a vision your character experiences of Bastila fighting Darth Revan, which is to say the tutorial sequence I'm proposing is actually already in the game. It's just presented as a cutscene instead of gameplay. I think this shift would make a significant difference in retaining new players' interest to continue with the game, even though it doesn't begin with Jedi powers. With this new sequence, you could also remove the scene of a Jedi fighting a Sith and get rid of the frustration that comes from not being able to loot the lightsaber. In fact, you could probably redesign the entire Endar Spire so it's a tutorial experienced as Bastila attacking Revan's Revan's ship. Bastila's strike team could feature 2 unique party members with their own skill points to accentuate the skills mechanic, which is currently a bit of an afterthought after that first door. If you really want to do fan service, you could make one of those party members Trask Ulgo and have him choose to leave the party early on to go back to the Endar Spire for some reason. The only challenge to this new tutorial sequence is the game would have to choose Bastila's abilities rather than have the player choose them when she joins the party later. At that point, it may be more valuable to drop Bastila's section of this proposed tutorial and simply have the player control Darth Revan's final moments before his encounter with Bastila. I think that would be a more affecting introduction while also increasing the prominence of important characters. You can also leave the Endar Spire as it is because it's mostly successful at what it needs to do. It establishes the narrative well enough. You learn everything you need to propel your way through the tutorial sequence. You learn Bastila is a Jedi, and since this is Star Wars, the player will remember any character who is a Jedi. The Endar Spire also shepherds you to the first major story character in the game with Carth, who you'll take an escape pod with to what I refer to as the prologue sequence of the game. At this point, we're beyond the tutorial. We're at the beginning of the adventure that is Knights of the Old Republic, one of the most beloved RPGs of all time, and it begins with this prologue on a planet known as Taris. Okay, so you've probably heard everybody hates Taris. One of the most popular mods for Knights of the Old Republic is called Skip Taris, which lets you skip Taris. There's some legitimate reasons for ranking Taris low compared to the rest of the game, but let's be real. The reason people don't like Taris is because you're not a Jedi. Your character will never touch a lightsaber while on Taris. It's also a planet that takes at minimum 3 hours to complete, so a lot of people see this section of the game as a frustrating delay of KOTOR's central appeal. I don't think Taris is that bad. Actually, I don't think Taris is bad at all. I can already feel my instinct to appease the general opinion, but it's stupid. It's frustrating Taris has so much negative propaganda, which deters new players from enjoying Knights of the Old Republic. It is true the rest of KOTOR is way better than Taris, but you wouldn't know that unless you already played the rest of the game. I think that's why experienced players dislike Taris so much. They'd rather be playing the rest of the game. But framing the game for new players in this way does more damage than people realize. If you've ever had a friend recommend a television show with the caveat that you have to watch 4 or 5 episodes before it gets good, you can imagine what it feels like to get KOTOR recommended to you with the qualifier that the first 5 hours of the game are bad. I don't think the first 5 hours of KOTOR are bad. If anything, it should be kind of exciting to know the game will only get better after Taris. I'll continue my defense of this planet as a Taris enjoyer throughout this video, but now you know my bias up front. After leaving the Endar Spire, you'll get a series of cutscenes. One of the actual escape, a quick line of dialogue from Carth saying you're injured, and a vision of Bastila fighting Darth Revan. I've already shown all this footage in the video because I can only repeat the same footage from the Endar Spire so many times. The vision is a neat narrative trick to introduce the player to Bastila in a way that's natural to the player character's experience. You've already heard Bastila's name a few times, and you'll hear it again from Carth in a minute, but without this vision, the player would have no idea what she looks like. She's not in the opening cutscene, you haven't spoken to her directly, and you won't for another few hours. The vision serves an immediate practical purpose of showing you who Bastila is, but it's not a one-off. Your character will continue to get visions throughout the game, and these visions are tied to your relationship with Bastila. For now, you get a tiny glimpse of this one vision, but there will be more in the future. When you wake up, Carth will acknowledge you've been thrashing in your sleep as if you were having a nightmare. Here you can make the decision to tell Carth about the vision or keep it to yourself. This is one of those role-playing decisions that I think are meaningful but sometimes overlooked by players. We'll talk about the value of these minor decisions later on when we have some more examples. Whatever you decide to say to Carth, he'll explain the key details of your situation.
We're in an abandoned apartment on the planet of Taris. We were banged up pretty bad when our escape pod crashed, but luckily I wasn't seriously hurt. I was able to drag you away from our crash site and all the confusion, and I stumbled into this abandoned apartment. By the time the Sith arrived on the scene, we were long gone.
Taris is under lockdown by the Sith as they look for Bastila, who went missing following the space battle that included the Endar Spire. You and Carth were in the same escape pod that crashed nearby, but Carth knows Bastila was in her own escape pod. Your mission is to now find out what happened to her. Carth's expediency at getting to the point is another example of the writer's understanding the player needs more investment in the story before they're interested in the details. Knights of the Old Republic is pitched as a game where your actions can influence the events of the galaxy. So sitting in a room getting exposition on things that already happened isn't exactly part of that pitch. The dialogue with Carth moves towards action. The game wants you to be involved in the story. At the same time, this conversation with Carth does a good job to expand the scope of the world with skilled placement of lore concepts and subplots. For example, Carth references Kolto packs when you're recovering, which we can only assume helps with injuries. He also brushes past this summary of recent events.
Bastila's a Jedi. She was with the strike team that killed Darth Revan, Malak's Sith Master.
If you know anything about Star Wars lore, then the concept a Jedi would intentionally kill someone should give you pause. Maybe this vision of Bastila will eventually give you unique insight on how that happened. But to echo a point I made earlier, the game knows you're not invested in Bastila's story enough to find this little detail interesting, so it moves past it to get you to the actual game. You get just enough information to know what you're doing on Taris. You're here to find Bastila. This initial conversation creates a sense of urgency to your goal, because you know the Sith are actively looking for Bastila as well, and that sense of urgency is maintained throughout the Taris prologue. Carth is the first real party member in the game since Trask was exclusive to the tutorial. His voice actor makes a strong first impression of his character. I think Knights of the Old Republic was one of the first games I played with fully cast voice acting, so the believability of Carth's delivery has stayed with me over the years.
Taris is under Sith control. Their fleet is orbiting the planet, they've declared martial law, and they've imposed a planet-wide quarantine. But I've been in worse spots.
He just sounds like a resolute and reliable company man, but with a hint of innocence and naivete that might get him into trouble. That's generally the impression most people get of Carth's character based on the few lines he has in this sequence. This is especially true for when he responds to dark side dialogue options.
I don't think you understand the situation. Well, we can't hide on this planet forever. Eventually the Sith will find us, and trust me, you don't want that.
Carth is also the first person in the game who attempts to gracefully explain your character's importance.
I saw on your service records that you understand a remarkable number of alien languages. That's pretty rare in a raw recruit.
I've dubbed these instances as convenient writing. Knights of the Old Republic does this a lot. Obviously, the reason your character speaks a bunch of languages is because you're the main character of a video game. I don't blame the writers for trying to explain this within the universe, but this example is silly. It's silly because every character in the game understands alien dialects. The world operates as if everyone has access to the universal translator from Star Trek. You don't need to emphasize the convenience through this line. You can ask Carth some additional details about Malak and Revan or the city of Taris, but it's not vital. Anything that is vital will weave its way back into the story somehow. For example, Carth can tell you some pretty interesting details about Malak and Revan right now, but he'll reiterate this information in a future dialogue exchange that's part of the story. I should say again, you won't see Malak or Revan for several hours. This cutscene that I've shown a few times is way later in the game. I just thought the visual reference would be useful. You don't need to know more about these guys because they're not immediately relevant to what you need to accomplish on Taris. Before you leave the apartment, you'll have access to a workbench. This is KOTOR's upgrade system for gear, and it's pretty basic. You can upgrade lightsabers, armor, melee weapons, or blasters, but there's no thought needed for how you upgrade things. Each item has a set number of slots that can be filled with exactly one type of upgrade. There is no decision making here. You either have the one and only upgrade item or you don't. The exception to this is lightsabers, but we'll cover that later. By the way, this workbench is also why I have no problem, quote, spoiling the game by saying you eventually get a lightsaber, because the game basically tells you that through systems like the workbench. Right now, the only item you have that can be upgraded is the prototype vibroblade you got from the Endar Spire. If you looted all the bodies during the tutorial, you should have an upgrade that gives you an attack boost to this weapon. The prototype vibroblade was already the best weapon in your inventory, and this upgrade makes it a smidge better. You can also upgrade Carth's blaster pistol, but the game doesn't actually add him to your party until you leave this apartment, so you can't actually upgrade it until you leave and come back. Welcome to 2003 game design. Outside of the apartment, you will immediately run into a Sith raid. The officer will kill one of the aliens for protesting about their treatment from the Sith, then you'll have a combat encounter. The surviving alien will say he'll hide the bodies to keep you out of trouble since you just saved his life. If it's not clear from the officer's accusation, aliens are second-class citizens in Taris's upper city. This is one of several ways the game clues you into what type of world Taris is without directly saying it. I'm repeating myself here, but Knights of the Old Republic is a video game that is best experienced as something you play. When I mean mean when I say that is there are some things that are more enjoyable when you interact with them in the game rather than hearing me tell you about it in this video. No one in the game takes your character aside and says, "Let me tell you about Terrace's stratified society." But you can piece that information together through various interactions, environmental details, and paying attention to your experience. One thing you might notice is there aren't a lot of aliens in the upper city. This can explain some interactions you can have in this initial apartment building. For example, the Duros you speak to after this combat encounter tells you aliens are not allowed to live in upper city apartments. This particular apartment building is more lenient about the rules, but generally aliens who live here are deferential to other humans because the aliens don't have the same rights. Immediately after this conversation, you can explore different apartment units in this building, and almost all of them have aliens. If you talk to these alien NPCs, they plead for you to take anything of value and to please leave them alone. This makes sense. You just learned aliens aren't supposed to live here at all. If two humans showed up with blasters and swords, it makes sense the aliens respond as if they are helpless to resist. They're not supposed to be there at all, so it's not like they can call the Sith for help. Some people in the community think it's very funny to point out you can loot people's apartments with no consequence. If you're paying attention, the lack of consequence makes sense in this context. The game doesn't need to make this more obvious, it's already clear. I guess this isn't a big deal, but when I was doing research for this video, I found a lot of silly suggestions from the community on what they would change, so this is my platform to come to the game's defense. One of the suggestions was giving the player dark side points for looting, but I think that would inadvertently suggest to new players looting isn't something you should do. Dark side points would feel like a punishment, and you don't want to punish engaging with a core element of the game like loot. The idea of giving dark side points is to communicate the morality of your decisions, but there is already a mechanic for that in the game. If you make any morally depraved decisions while in the upper city, you'll earn a comment from Carth.
What's wrong with you? She doesn't deserve this.
Actually, this is true of any moral action in general, not just dark side options.
You're giving him 100 credits? Generous.
These comments are more frequent during the upper city, but they'll drop off a lot after that. The reason for these comments is to convey to the player the concept of the alignment system. The game needs to communicate the moral alignment system without having the consequences of these choices be too abstract or too punishing. The first few choices you can make won't result in any alignment shifts at all. You'll just get a comment from Carth. This provides immediate feedback to the player about their choices without making the player feel punished because they gain dark side points just to see what the novelty option would do. These training wheels won't last for long, and soon enough you'll gain alignment points for these types of decisions. Carth will continue to make comments, as will other party members, but these comments will be more so expressions of their character rather than teaching you the alignment system. As you explore this first building, you'll discover many of the doors are locked. If you took the single point in security during the tutorial, you should be able to unlock every single one of them. If not, Carth also has the necessary security skill. This may make security seem pretty useful, but like most skills, there's a workaround. Your character can open any locked door in the game by brute forcing it with your weapon. This can be time consuming, but there is no penalty for this method of unlocking doors. This is another reason why I say skills aren't very important. Almost every instance of a security check in the game can be circumvented by bashing something open. There are exceptions of doors that cannot be opened through bashing, but they're usually related to a quest. I recommend getting the 1 point in security to save yourself some time, but beyond that, I never use this skill on my main character. While exploring the apartments, you'll get stopped by a kiosk owner who is the second instance of the game explaining why swords exist in the universe. This kiosk specializes in selling energy shields. The owner explains this new technology is resistant to blaster fire, which prompted the Republic to train people in vibroblades that can cut through these shields. That's why everyone has swords. These shields will be used by enemies throughout the game. Anytime you see someone covered in a blue or green glow, that means they're using a shield. Energy shields are certainly useful, but there's no reason to buy them from this guy. You will trip over a half a dozen shields in the first few hours of the game, and you won't need any more for a while. Once you exit the apartments, you'll get your first impression of Terrace. It's been over 20 years since this game came out, but I still remember when I first saw Terrace's upper city. The wide open environment and the music accompanying it do an effective job creating a sense of place. Terrace has the sleek utopian look of high society. I remember when I was a kid, it seemed like an actual populated city with people going about their day. The immense skybox added to the sense of scale of the environment. It felt like I was in the center of a megalopus. These visuals are strengthened by the music and the sound design, which I would call classic Star Wars. The orchestral music has its swells, and the ambient sound design includes ships zooming by as you walk around. By modern game standards, Terrace is tiny. There's only a handful of locations to explore. As for those NPCs I thought were going about their day, they just walk back and forth to create the illusion of activity. But the illusion is effective at first glance. Your impression enables your imagination to think big, and I still feel that way whenever I get to this part of the game. Terrace always feels like a world full of possibilities, like you only see a small sliver of something much bigger. It's one of the reasons it's disappointing to hear fans rag on Terrace, because I think the remake could make Terrace more substantial. Modern technology could make this massive city really come to life. But I imagine it's hard to argue for an investment in those resources when this planet has the reputation of the part of the game everyone allegedly dislikes. The level design of Terrace effectively boils down to 4 or maybe 5 locations of interest. The first location you'll come across is immediately across from your starting location, where you'll find another kiosk vendor. This vendor actually has some surprisingly good gear you can purchase with credits. At this point in the game, you won't have a lot of credits, but you do have a lot of stuff you can sell. If you have more than 2 of the same weapon, you really don't need the excess. Any additional party member you'll gain will have their own unique weapons, so you don't have to save items for them. If you do have credits to spend and you want your player character to dual wield weapons, I recommend getting the Echani Ritual brand. This weapon gives you 3 to 13 damage per hit, which is pretty incredible this early in the game, though you probably want to wait on using it until you have the second level of the dual wielding feat at level 4, otherwise you'll just miss over and over and over. This vendor also has a permacret detonator that's used for a side quest later. The detonator is placed among the other store items as if it is a unique quest item, so I've actually always bought this item even on my very first playthrough just because it seemed important. If you purchase it now, you'll save some backtracking for later. Past the vendors, the Upper City Cantina, which I would consider the most significant location on Terrace. There's a lot you can do here, but I want to start with this one NPC named Ghana Lavin.
Where did you get those clothes? A trash compactor in the lower city? And where are those drinks we ordered?
Ghana is an uppity Teresian noble who mistakes you for a waiter. If you talk back to her, she'll ambush you outside the cantina with thugs, but it's not a very difficult combat encounter. By itself, Ghana is a minor diversion. There's no broader questline or anything. You never see her again after this, and most players probably don't interact with her at all. Honestly, I probably shouldn't refer to her as a point of interest. I just like this character because she articulates a trend across Knights of the Old Republic, which is its prejudice against British people. Pretty much every character in the game with a British accent is a jerk. I don't know if this is an accident or an intentional decision, like an allegory between the British Empire and the Sith Empire, but I do find it very funny. Mostly everything in the cantina is optional, with the exception of a conversation with a woman named Sarna.
Hi there. I haven't seen you around before. Of course, they don't give us Sith officers from the military base much time off.
Sarna works for the Sith, and she's frustrated so many people dislike her just because she's working for an amoral and ruthless galactic dictatorship. She wants to unwind from her work frustrations, and you can fulfill this for her through some dialogue options. You can pick flattering dialogue options, which will result in her inviting you to a party with her colleagues. At least she does if you're a male character. If you're a female character, you can have the same exact conversation with a male NPC around the corner.
Hi there. Haven't seen you around before. Of course, they don't give us Sith officers from the military base much time off.
Of course, both the male and female NPCs for this interaction are British, so you know they're awful people. The party with Sarna is an interesting design decision that's repeated across Terrace. The game repeatedly gives the players solutions to problems they don't have yet. Throughout Terrace, you'll set things up without knowing why you should be doing them. At best, you can assume the game gave you this option, so you might as well take it. It's not clear how a party with Sith soldiers will advance your quest to find Bastila, but it will become clear later on. I'm not certain if this design decision was intentional, but it is smart in retrospect because it gives the player clear breadcrumbs to keep playing the game. As I mentioned, people tend to view Terrace as an inconvenience. If you had to create your own investment by figuring out what to do next or solve a slightly more difficult quest, then it's possible you could have bounced off the game completely. Instead, you have these mini milestones like Sarna. You don't have to figure out what to do. Instead, you're drawn by the intrigue of what might happen next. You might be thinking, well, I wish I had a lightsaber already, but I do want to see what happens with this party at Sarna's. By the time you get to the party, you may have more investment in the game to care about the main quest. There is a cascade of these circumstances throughout Terrace. There are 2 other points of interest in this cantina. One of them is a guy selling a deck of cards for a game called Pazaak. Pazaak has a passionate fan base among the KOTOR community, but I'll talk about it later when there's more depth added to the game. I recommend first-time players don't play Pazaak anywhere on Terrace. Your first deck will be bad, and the people you can play with are unsatisfying for distinct reasons, so it's best to ignore it for now. The second point of interest is the dueling arena. This is one of the two major side quests on Terrace. You can talk to the hut named Ajur to set up a one-on-one duel with another contestant. If you win, you'll get 100 credits plus another 100 for each successive victory. At this point in the game, you are most likely level 3, and at that level, you can easily defeat the first two duelists, but the third contestant will probably destroy you. You can come back later when you have more levels or at least better gear. When you're done with the cantina, you can walk back out to the Terrace Upper City and run into the next location called Zelka's. Zelka is a doctor who has a medical facility, and the first thing he'll mention to you is the Rakghoul disease.
You require healing or medical supplies? I can treat almost any injury or ailment right here at the medical facility. Except the Rakghoul disease, of course.
This is another example of Terrace's quest design setting up solutions to problems you don't have. Rakghouls are in the Undercity of Terrace, not to be confused with the Lower City of Terrace. Rakghouls are bestial creatures that attack anything in sight. They have a venom that if it infects you, you will slowly become a Rakghoul as well. Okay, maybe not that slow. Zelka is concerned about this disease, and without asking about it, he will tell you that there's no cure. But if there was a cure, he would distribute it to the public. In contrast, when you go to leave this facility, Zelka's assistant will stop you and say, if you find the Rakghoul cure, you can also sell it for a profit to a criminal organization in the Lower City. Zelka and the Rakghoul serum are the player's first exposure to a real moral alignment choice in Knights of the Old Republic. This quest presents the common categories of solution for these alignment decisions. You may assume there are two outcomes, a light side solution and a dark side solution, but there is also a third path that is articulated in this quest. The light path benefits the public good and often requires self-sacrifice. Light side solutions usually include more difficult challenges or losing personal wealth to aid others in need.
You'd give 200 credits to a stranger just to help them out?
Unlike other games like BioShock, the light path doesn't typically result in its own kind of reward to match the dark side equivalent. For example, if you take all the light side solutions for quests on Terrace, you're choosing to miss out on some 5,000 credits or more. It is a significant difference for the first planet, but over the course of the game, you should be fine. You may not be able to buy a lot of cool gear, but I generally think the light side solutions to quests provide the most satisfying narrative conclusions. The dark path, in its purest form, is adhering to a hierarchy of power. Dark side solutions take every opportunity to make your character stronger, and because of your strength, you have a reason to terrorize the weak. The dark side options in KOTOR are sometimes criticized as cartoonish. There are certainly examples of that, but I think there's a lot more going on with that critique than occasional goofy dialogue options. We'll talk about that when we have a few more examples to work with. Obviously, in this example of Zelka, selling the cure takes advantage of the weak and strengthens your own position. The third path, which is sometimes overlooked, is the path of self-interest. This will often result in dark side points, but it's not the same thing as the dark path. These are dialogue options where you advocate for your own well-being or seek to expand your own personal wealth. This is the Han Solo option, and I wouldn't call it evil.
Oh, I get it. Never mind that the Sith will destroy the Republic and ravage the galaxy. You're only in this for the credits. Don't worry, the Republic pays its mercenaries well.
For example, the player has already had dialogue options to express they don't care about the Jedi or Bastila and they just want to get to safety. This isn't an evil thing to say, it's just a clear primacy for self-interest. Throughout the game, you'll have the options between light side, dark side, and self-interest. For Zelka's quest, there is a binary choice: give the cure to the public or profit from selling it. In this instance, the self-interest path and the dark path are the same, but that's not always the case. Usually the three approaches are more present when you take on a quest rather than how you complete it. For example, saying you want to help people, hurt people, or just get paid. Zelka's quest is also the first quest you can lock yourself out of if you're too evil too quickly. If you extort Zelka, he won't talk to you about the cure, which means his assistant won't suggest you sell the cure either. This means even if you find the cure later in the game, there won't be an NPC to engage with to finish the quest. This problem is brought to you by 2003 Game Design. The Rakghoul serum is the first major alignment decision, but there are a lot of minor decisions throughout Terrace's Upper City. You'll get repeated prompts to engage with passerbys, and all of them have a light side, dark side, or self-interest resolution. There's the old man being shaken down for money, the alien harassed by kids, the drunks harassing you, and the racist town crier warning about alien infestation. These smaller interactions aren't common over the course of the entire game, but KOTOR delivers them back to back early on, so the player is keenly aware of the alignment system. Typically, you you don't make an alignment decision until a quest's conclusion. So without these smaller examples, you probably wouldn't make any alignment decisions until much later in the game. This is also why the first batch of decisions results in a comment from Carth. These smaller examples keep the mechanic top of mind and invite you to flesh out your character more. With each decision, you, the player, are making a choice on how you relate to the character you are playing, and that's more valuable to the experience than the alignment points you earn. On the north side of Terrace's upper city, you'll find another apartment complex. This is where you can meet up with Sarna for the Sith party. Sarna will immediately get blackout drunk, along with the rest of the soldiers, which is not an inaccurate depiction of how military service members let loose. You can't loot their bodies because they're not dead, but there is a backpack with Sith armor inside it. The Sith armor is the solution for a problem you haven't encountered yet, so just hold on to it for now. There are some other interactions you can have in this apartment, but around now, you'll likely to get a prompt to talk to Carth. If you've already played this game, you'll know this is actually the second prompt, but I'm focusing on this one because Carth has something interesting to say now. Your initial conversations with Carth are one of the smartest decisions Knights of the Old Republic makes to keep the player engaged with the world. At this point, Carth has been thinking about your situation, and he's decided it's very strange your character is not only alive, but an integral part of the mission to find Bastila. The conversation devolves into Carth accusing you of having some involvement in the Endar Spire's destruction.
No? Well, maybe. Don't get me wrong, it just seems odd that someone Bastila's party specifically requested to transfer aboard happens to survive.
This is such a smart design decision because it forces the player to consider their character and their relationship with Carth. Unlike so many other RPGs, KOTOR doesn't let you be a faceless hero. This isn't a game where everyone gives you command and powers without thinking about it. Your existence in the game's world has a context, and that context can be scrutinized. Carth is skeptical of your character's presence, and you, the player, have to justify it through this conversation. Whether you choose to appease Carth or tell him to screw off is a role-playing decision you are making for your character. These decisions make your character feel more real, and you're more attached to the game's world as a result. Of course, Carth is actually responding to convenient writing. Obviously, the reason you're the sole survivor of the Endar Spire is because you're the main character of a video game. But making Carth skeptical of your character's backstory lessens the obviousness of the convenience, and it makes it a believable point of conflict between these two characters. It is weird you're the only survivor. That's not something that's hand-waved in the story. It's something you have to deal with in your relationship with Carth and elsewhere in the story. This conversation is more than an acknowledgement of your character's circumstance. It also gets to the heart of Carth's character arc. I only reference it vaguely for now, but Carth indicates he has reason to be suspicious of other people. It's clear Carth at some point in his past has experienced a betrayal. He won't be open to talking about it now, and you'll have to continue the conversation later. I find Carth's secrecy refreshing compared to other RPGs. More often than not, RPGs will let new NPCs spill their life story to you without prompting. It's for this reason I usually don't talk to my party members in other games at all. But KOTOR is smarter about these things. The writers know the player's tolerance for learning more about the world. You won't get everything from Carth immediately. It's spaced out over the course of the Terrace prologue. It's another breadcrumb among many others to give you short-term investment in the game. It's also nice that it breaks up the combat and quest encounters with some interpersonal conflict. After you leave these apartments, the remaining relevant location is an elevator leading to the lower city. But oh no! Only Sith can go down to the lower city. This would be a huge problem if the game's quest design hadn't already solved it for you. If you have to be a Sith to get through the elevator, simply go to your inventory, equip the Sith armor, then walk right into— wait.
This elevator is off limits. Only Sith patrols and those with proper authorization are allowed into the lower city. It's obvious from the way you're dressed that you're not one of the Sith patrols, so unless you have the authorization papers, you must move along.
Okay. My character is dressed as a Sith, but Carth is not. That's what's blocking my progress. I guess this problem is unique to the Restored Content mod, which includes an additional Sith armor you have to find. If you're playing the vanilla version of the game, such as the Switch port released in 2021, you won't have this problem. Personally, I have never sought out the second armor until making this video, mainly because it's way easier to go to your party selection, remove Carth from your party, trigger the quest point milestone, then add Carth back into your party right in front of this guard who apparently doesn't care. The other armor is located in the same room where the party happened. You just have to backtrack there after you can't progress any further without it. You'll have a minor alignment choice through deciding when to interfere with an interrogation, but I don't think this adds anything to the game. This is a good time to mention all of the restored content for Knights of the Old Republic is work that was finished, but BioWare chose to remove from the final release. This is very different from Knights of the Old Republic 2, which has its own restored content mod that effectively completes a game game that was released unfinished. All of the restored content in KOTOR 1 was removed for a reason. In this instance, backtracking is never great quest design, and attacking 2 Sith officers is antithetical to Karth's common refrain that you need to avoid attention. If you're playing this game on the Switch where there are no mods, you're not missing anything. Just take the elevator down like everyone else. The lower city of Taris will greet you with a gang war.
Karatumpa kunpaliya mokapata. Nanay kachu. Yinkin kunoba mulirachi kun. Tong napun siya nyunyan. Ijuta. Yun patisa.
The 2 sides are the Hidden Becks and the Black Vulkars. They're essential to the main quest and, more importantly, give you humanoid bad guys to fight. The gang fight may be enough to understand how the lower city is different from the upper city, but the contrast is accentuated by the environmental design. Taris's upper city is drenched in natural light, with a wide-open skyline showcasing massive structures towering over you. Taris's lower city is dark and closed off. In the few areas with windows of any kind, you can only see a few hundred feet before another brutalist structure obscures your view. The first area you can explore in the lower city is another apartment complex which looks similar to the ones above but with its own distinct features. These apartments are marred by blaster fire, explosives residue, and even exposed flooring in some spots. The residents of these apartments are also different. You'll run into gang members as combatants, but even the friendly NPCs are armed with blasters or vibroblades to protect themselves. The environmental differences between the upper and lower city are another way of the game communicating Taris's stratified society without outright telling you. The most interesting room in these apartments is a mini-quest about the Twisted Rancor Trio. You'll find a room with a locker box in the center and 7 holograms surrounding it. Nearby is a computer where you can pick up a data pad with the history of a musical group called the Twisted Rancor Trio. The history will detail which members joined first, and you can use that information to activate the holograms in the order of how each member joined. If you do it successfully, the locker box opens and you get an Enchani armor, which is one of the best items in the game. This type of quest is a relic of older game design, and I miss it when playing modern games. This quest relies entirely on reading comprehension rather than gameplay mechanics. Knights of the Old Republic does this type of quest a lot throughout the game, and it makes it stand out from modern titles in the same genre. Video games don't have puzzles like this one anymore. Even games with a remarkably excellent quest design like The Witcher 3 or Mass Effect don't include quests that require a minimum amount of knowledge retention or deductive reasoning. Modern game design has everything reduced to an enemy that you need to attack, or a prompt that you need to click. I know a lot of this streamlining was to make games more accessible, but I think we lost something with the current direction of the industry. KOTOR has a lot of these puzzles. Most of them are simple, but they add to the diversity of the gameplay experience. I'll point out some of my favorites as we progress through the game. Once you're done with the apartments, you'll make your way further into the lower city and find another cantina. Unlike the upper city cantina, this one is for all the underworld criminals. This is made evident by the introduction of one of the more memorable antagonists in Knights of the Old Republic, Calo Nord.
Go away.
Chiska nichu. Kimba muli radwanaji. Kimba noku nixat abong. Kakincha nawabakaon. Tung abashun ni chunchi. Kipuna. Kavatumpa kulpaliya mokapaata. Chiyoka kutumpa kulpaliya.
1.
Oscar. Chiska nichu. The hupa botenya go GGPT.
Kipuna! Kavatumpa kupalea mukabata! Jiyoka kutumpa kupalea!
2.
Jiyokaku! Kimba muli radwanaji. Kuyami juski chika nai. Ubabaska dwana chichopa muska. Chiska da soki kupa bona na chachu.
Tune pudu! Rananu prata donko shirkasha! Jum apike!
3.
Calo Nord is a fan favorite. It's not hard to figure out why. He's a bounty hunter, and bounty hunters are innately cool. This was proven half a century ago when Boba Fett became an iconic character in Star Wars despite barely having any spoken lines. Like Boba Fett, Calo Nord's characterization is paper thin. In fact, BioWare designer John Gallagher was asked about various character designs in KOTOR, and part of his comments included, quote, "I think Calo Nord is just another goofball," end quote. Calo Nord's outfit is ridiculous. lines. And he only speaks in action movie quips, but it doesn't matter because being a bounty hunter is cool. Calo Nord shows up a few times throughout the story, and his introduction as a deadly man of few words is almost certainly what earns him so many fans. If you think bounty hunting is cool, you'll love the major side quest available in this cantina. In one of the side rooms, you can find a Hutt named Zax, who gives out criminal and government bounty contracts. At this point in the game, you have likely already met at least 2 bounty targets. If you chose to kill them on sight, you can turn in a bounty to Zax for 300 credits each. Most of these bounties have a non-lethal light side solution as well, but these solutions often require additional information or items and backtracking. Sometimes the light side solution results in negating the bounty contract, so you won't actually get paid for them. If you do decide to do the light side solutions, you won't need to literally backtrack. Following the main quest will eventually teleport you back to the starting apartment in the upper city. You can complete all the bounties on Taris without ever backtracking. Bounty contracts are optional, so I'll talk about them at the end of the Taris chapter. Other than the bounties, this cantina has more Pazak. There's a guy named Gelrud who states in his introduction he was banned from other cantinas for cheating at Pazak, but he'll offer to play you anyway. I don't have confirmation on this, but I am fairly confident Gelrud cheats against you. I have never won against this guy, and it's part of the reason I say you shouldn't play Pazak on Taris. The method of cheating is all the cards he draws tend to be very low, whereas all the ones I have to draw tend to be very high. This means I'm forced to use a card or commit to my position before him, and somehow he always ends up with a better outcome. It is kind of neat to include an unscrupulous player in a game that attracts unscrupulous people, but this is only the second guy in the whole game who will play Pazak, and it seems like a horrible decision to turn players off to the minigame by throwing them a challenge they can't possibly win. To make things worse, you have to bet money to play Gelrud, and the default of 40 credits is quite a lot to lose this early in the game. This is part of the reason I say not to play Pazak at all on Taris. If you walk around the cantina, you will almost certainly run into 2 characters named Mission and Zalbar. Mission and Big Z, as he's known, are a kind of Han Solo and Chewbacca variant for Knights of the Old Republic, but there's more to these characters than that reductive comparison. They're closer to a big brother, little sister combination rather than a chatty scoundrel and silent brute. The duo will be confronted by some lower city gang members, and the dynamic between the two will become clear.
Who you call a little girl, Chuba Face? Just a sec, boys. Zalbar, a little help here? I need you to rip the legs off some insects. Quit complaining. You can finish eating later. Besides, you need the exercise, so get over here.
Mission is the hotshot teenager who has an unearned amount of confidence, while Zalbar intimidates others into submitting to her quips. After they settle their confrontation, you can talk to Mission about the lower city gangs, but you can't do anything with them just yet. Mission and Zalbar are another example of Taris's quest design providing solutions to problems you don't have yet. You'll meet up with both of them soon enough. Back outside the cantina, you can progress further into the lower city and find a door to the Hidden Becks base. Yes, despite the name, it's not a secret location or anything, it's right off the main hallway. Inside, you'll meet a man named Gadin, who is the leader of the Hidden Becks, alongside his attack dog bodyguard, Zerdra. This combination of head person in charge next to their mini-boss companion is a common dynamic in D&D that Knights of the Old Republic uses frequently. Zerdra will play the bad cop, while Gadin reels her back. I've always wondered what was the point of Zerdra in this interaction, since neither of these characters are very significant in the grand scheme of things. In context with your imminent conversation with Gadin, I think her purpose is to make Gadin appear reasonable. Gadin's method of speech is obviously very different from Zerdra's aggressive style. In this short conversation with Gadin, he'll give you the details of what happened to Bastila, and in doing so, he'll include comments that make his characters seem like the better option in the gang war.
Do you want us to start attacking strangers on sight, Zerdra? Like the Vulkars do? I will never let it come to that. We Becks don't believe in intergalactic slavery, but the Vulkars aren't so picky.
This is in contrast to the Vulkars, who Gadin will tell you already found Bastila. The Vulkars found the escape pods, captured Bastila, and enslaved her with the intention of awarding her as a prize in an upcoming illegal swoop race. After telling you this, Gadin will then pitch working together in a way that benefits you both. He says you can enter the swoop race under the Hidden Becks name and win Bastila, but to secure your victory, you'll need a prototype accelerator for your swoop bike. The accelerator is in the Vulkar base, so you'll need to sneak in and steal it. I've never never liked how the Swoop Gang dilemma is so one-sided. If the accelerator is with the Volkers, wouldn't it be easier to simply work with the Volkers instead of the Becks? The reason this option isn't presented to the player is because the Volkers are depicted as evil. After all, they attack civilians and enslave people, unlike this Gaddon guy who leads a gang that does other crimes that aren't as bad, I guess. But hey, he stopped Zerdra from being mean to you, so clearly he's the better option. Gaddon says he has an accomplice who can sneak you into the Volker base. This accomplice is Mission, who we just met at the cantina.
Mission? Gaddon, you can't be serious. She's just a kid. How is she supposed to help them with this?
Mission's explored every step of every back alley in the lower city. Plus, she knows the undercity sewers better than anyone. If anyone can get inside the Volker base, it's her.
Mission was last seen in the Undercity, so you'll have to go find her. Gaddon gives you the authorization papers to get to the Undercity, and with that you're on your way to find Mission. At this point, it might feel like you're getting sent on a diversion, but I've always appreciated how Knights of the Old Republic keeps the goal of finding Bastila front and center. It's been slightly augmented from find Bastila to find Mission to find Bastila, but you're still very much pursuing the original goal. This isn't some tangential storyline that RPGs love to send you on to make the story longer. More importantly, you've likely gained some investment in the world at this point. Sure, you've been focusing on the objectives, such as meeting a Sith soldier, getting their armor, and making it to the lower city, but along the way, you've gained a sense of agency over the story. You've had minor morality alignment decisions to flesh out your character's view of the world, but more importantly, you've had to resolve the animosity coming from Carth. How you chose to do that, such as defending yourself or turning the tables on him, has created a sense of who you are in this game. This is the role-playing part of the phrase role-playing game. You should have enough of a foundation to start engaging with the game's challenges and quandaries. Does your character care about the Becks and Gaddon? What will you do when you find that Rakghoul serum? Is Carth annoying you enough to hope for a replacement, or do you understand where he's coming from? You care about these questions because they'll influence how you play the game, which is another way of saying they have a mechanical consequence. You're invested in the events of the story, and that should get you through the next sequence of Taris, which is primarily combat-oriented. The Undercity and subsequent areas are effectively 3 dungeons back-to-back, but thankfully you're invested in the outcome of this lengthy sequence thanks to what the game accomplished in the upper and lower city. Before we get to the Undercity, there is one last apartment you can explore in the lower city. Before you enter the apartment, you'll run into a man named Canderous Ordo.
Those Volkers are dumber than a Coruscant granite slug. They actually think being in that pathetic little gang of theirs makes them important. Gaddon keeps his hidden Becks in line, but Brejik's getting dreams of grandeur. If Davik's smart, he'll slap that young punk back down.
Canderous is like Calo Nord. He's hired muscle for a criminal organization called The Exchange. Unlike Calo Nord, Canderous will talk to you briefly about the lower city gangs, and he'll reference some proper nouns you've heard a few times at this point, such as the Mandalorians or a man named Davik. Canderous's appearance here is like the one with Mission and Zalbar. He'll become relevant later on, but rather than have him magically appear when he's needed, the game introduces him ahead of his functional role in the story. If you enter these apartments, you'll see Calo Nord again, but this time he's working a bounty contract. I've always liked the physical comedy of this scene. Calo Nord will give your character the cold shoulder, but I don't think this was written in the game's script. I think the animators realized the character model could only turn in jerky movements, so to hide the limitations, they used it as a punchline. These apartments have more bounty contracts and another reading comprehension quest. This quest is another example of BioWare using the environment to tell a story. I feel like everyone in the video game industry started using the term environmental storytelling in 2007 with the release of BioShock, but games have been telling stories through their environment for a long time. In this instance, you find an apartment with a Volker gang member inside. There's a dead body on the ground and a computer with a letter from a guy's uncle. The letter alludes to the recipient's decision to leave his homeworld of Alderaan to try to make it on Taris. Obviously, you can conclude things didn't work out. Next to the computer is a locker box, but it's encrypted by personal security questions. To unlock it, you have to read the letter from the guy's uncle and deduce the answer to these questions. For example, the question, "Where did you grow up?" is obviously Alderaan. The questions are easy to resolve, but it's a nice change of pace. These apartments also have a room that's always confused me. In one of the units is a closet that opens to the Swoop racing track. You'll be transported here later for the main quest, but its placement in a random apartment closet has never made sense to me. You can't even do anything here, so why did they include it as an explorable area? Maybe there's a production story someone can share in the comments. At the end of the lower city is an elevator to the undercity. The lower city is significantly worse than the upper city, but somehow the undercity is even worse. The undercity isn't as claustrophobic thanks to its high ceilings, but that only contributes to the atmosphere of what appears to be a musty, dank cave. Despite being called the Undercity, there is no real civilization down here. The Undercity looks to be the only part of Taris that touches the planet's surface, which is primarily cracked dirt and weed-like grass, since not an inch of it is exposed to genuine sunlight. Upon your arrival, you'll be accosted by two bums who attempt to shake you down for 5 credits.
5 credits! That's what it costs to use our elevator. 5 credits!
5 credits is not a lot of money, but you can choose to scare them off without a penalty to your alignment. Alternatively, you can pay 20 credits out of concern for their well-being, which gets you some light side points. This interaction with the bums is a bit pointless, and the voice acting on the 2 characters is overdone and annoying, which makes it the perfect encapsulation of Taris's Undercity. When the community is asked to identify which sections of Knights of the Old Republic they like the most and least, the Taris Undercity is the second lowest in the entire game. This is pretty incredible on its own, and it's even more incredible when you consider the least liked and third least liked sections of the game. The least liked section, which we won't get to for a long time, suffers an obvious design flaw that can be resolved with a simple patch. Anyone who's played KOTOR can guess what section this is because it's fairly infamous. Meanwhile, the third least liked section received half as many votes as the Taris Undercity, which means the Undercity is more than twice as much disliked than the section in the third spot. To be fair to the Taris Undercity, I don't think this section is uniquely bad. It just so happens to be included in one of the greatest games of all time, and it's clearly not as good as the rest of it. You'll see why soon enough.
Those 2 beggars give everyone in the village a bad name. We aren't all like that, you know. Most of us are good people.
I'm sure you are, miss. It's just too bad your little welcoming committee is here to give people a bad first impression.
I guess Karth is from San Francisco. After dealing with the bums, you'll speak to a woman named Shalina, who gives you details on the village of the Undercity. There's a village leader named Gendar, and a village elder named Rukiel, who speaks about a prophesized promised land. While listening to Rukiel's overdone voice delivery, you can figure out why everyone dislikes the Undercity.
Legends tell of a self-sufficient colony founded just before the famine and lost during the Civil War. A paradise beneath the Undercity, where droid servants tend to every need.
It's simply not Star Wars. Rukiel has a quest to find the journals of his apprentices who sought out the Promised Land. This would be a fine diversion in any other fantasy RPG, but in a Star Wars game, it feels out of place. This is a universe with spacefaring and hyper-advanced technology, but the village outcast questline feels like it belongs in Dragon Age or some other low fantasy narrative. It doesn't help the characters in this area are all bad, categorizing themselves in either forgettable or memorable for the wrong reasons. Rukiel's voice acting isn't great, but he's not even the only character with silly voice delivery. There's also Aegir, who sounds like this.
I figured I'd wait until food was scarce and then I could offer it to people who'd follow me instead of Gendar. Then I'd be the leader.
Can you guess if Aegir is a good guy or not? Aegir offers you a dark side solution to Rukiel's questline, but it's unlikely you'll complete the Promised Land quest at all. You'll never come back to the Undercity after this first pass-through, so returning the journals you find later in the sewers would require backtracking to this spot. If you do decide to backtrack, you'll get some alignment points and potentially 100 credits, but that's not a good reason to return to this boring area. For most of the time I've played Knights of the Old Republic, I considered Aegir to serve a more functional purpose. He's the last shopkeeper you have access to before the back-to-back dungeons. Before leaving the Undercity, I would usually stock up on 20 medpacks, 8 advanced medpacks, and 3 to 5 antidote kits. However, while making this video, I finally experimented with the Return to Hideout function available on your map screen. It turns out clicking this option will instantly return you to your hideout. You can even go to the first shopkeeper and buy medpacks from him. Then whenever you're done, you can click Return to Transit and pop right back to where you were before. I've played this game enough times that I practically have it memorized, so I don't really need this mechanic anymore, but I thought I'd share it with anyone watching this because I don't think I'm the only one who didn't know that. The good news is this means Aegir is completely irrelevant, so you don't have to talk to him at all. Once you pass Aegir and leave the village, you'll run into the primary enemy of this area, the Rakghoul.
Help! It's right behind me! Help!
Hurry, Hindar! Hurry! I can hear it coming!
He'll never make it. He's doomed. I told him he was a fool to leave the village.
He will make it. Run, Hindar, run!
Open the gate! Quickly! There isn't much time!
I can't. The Rakghouls are too close.
The mutants will kill him if you don't open the gate!
And if I open the gate, they'll kill us all.
No! You can't do this! It isn't fair! Please, make him open the gate. Hindar will die if he doesn't.
I can't open the gate. Not while the Rakghouls are so near.
When you first exit the village, you'll get this sequence where you can choose to save a villager from a chasing Rakghoul. Saving him, or leaving him to die, gets you the appropriate alignment points, but you'll have to face the Rakghoul outside the gate no matter what you decide to do about the villager. Rakghouls can be pretty brutal in combat. They can inflict poison with their attacks, which means you take damage every round of combat. You can use antidote kits to remove the poison, but you'll probably get hit again immediately afterwards anyway. Personally, I think you're better off taking the damage and healing your party after the fight. If you're in a bigger combat encounter, you can use an antidote kit to avoid a tricky situation, but I wouldn't buy too many of them. There are only 4 entities in the entire game that can inflict poison, so it's not a big issue after Terrace. After dealing with the Rakghoul at the gate, you'll immediately run into Mission.
Please, you have to help me. Nobody else is gonna help me. Even the Becks won't help me. But I can't just leave him there. He's my friend. You'll help me, won't you?
Mission's companion Zalbar has been taken by Gamorrean slavers. He's being held captive in the sewers below the Undercity. Mission needs your help to find him, and you need her help to get into the Vulkar base, so you work out a deal. In exchange for saving Zalbar, Mission will help you get into the Vulkar base. With this agreement in place, Mission joins your party. If you choose to speak to her now, you'll quickly understand Mission's character. She'll tell you the story of how she became attached to Big Z, which started when Mission saw the Vulkars harassing Zalbar.
Anyway, I don't like the Vulkars at the best of times. And when I saw them picking on this poor Wookiee, all alone on a strange planet, overwhelmed by the big city, I just lost it. I screamed out, "Leave him alone, you core slimes!" and charged right at them. Well, one of them saw me coming and slapped me so hard he just about knocked me cold. I guess Zalbar didn't like seeing me get smacked around. He let out this howl and yanked that Vulkar a meter up off the ground and held him there by his throat. I thought Zalbar was gonna rip that punk's arms off and beat him to death with his own fists. The Vulkar was so scared, he fainted. Or maybe it was Big Z's breath just knocked him out. Anyway, I knew those Vulkars would be back with friends, so I grabbed Zalbar and we took off. Ever since then, we've been a team. We look out for each other, you know?
Mission is the type of character who has a lot of heart, but her inexperience sometimes leads to poor decision-making, such as picking a fight with the Vulkar gang. She makes these bad decisions because she's too young to have any real-life experience, and she's very self-conscious about this flaw. Mission has intense insecurity about her age and maturity, so she reacts strongly to any comments about her age. You'll see an example of this in the Undercity through a dialogue between Mission and Carth.
I don't have to listen to you, Carth. You ain't my father, though you're sure old enough to be. So keep your lectures inside your withered old head, because I don't need them.
These interactions quickly fill in the detail of her character. Mission has the gumption and skill set to be useful, but she's insecure people don't take her seriously. She wants to be viewed as a reliable person, and there is a reason for that you'll learn as you get to know her character. For now, you can see Mission's value through how she contributes to the mechanics of your party dynamic. Mission is what I would consider in D&D terms a classic rogue. She has what is referred to as utility. In Dungeons & Dragons, some spells are described as utility to indicate they're not intended for use within combat. For example, D&D has a spell called Shrink that lets characters reduce the size of an object or creature. This has minimal uses in combat, but if you need to transport a large object, such as a locked treasure chest, it can be useful to make it smaller. KOTOR's variant of utility is the skill system, which Mission has a lot of, but the trade-off is some obvious weaknesses. Mission's biggest weakness is her combat ability. She doesn't have a lot of vitality points. If you put her on the front line, she'll go down quick. She's better off taking shots from the back line, but this is unintuitive for new players because her starting equipment is a unique vibroblade, which suggests she should be using melee weapons. Personally, I find her far more effective using a blaster one-handed or a blaster rifle later in the game. The reason she's better at a distance is because of her class feat called Sneak Attack. I actually mentioned Sneak Attack back in the Endar Spire. It's a feat available to any Scoundrel class character, including including your player character if you chose Scoundrel at the beginning of the game. To reiterate how it works, the sneak attack feat allows the character to do extra damage if their target is facing away from them. The early levels of this ability are a small buff, adding an additional 1 to 6 points of damage per each attack. By the time Mission hits level 5, which should be during the Undercity, she'll have access to level 3 sneak attack, which results in an average of 10 extra points of damage per attack. If these numbers are meaningless to you, an extra 10 points of damage per attack is effectively doubling your damage output. It's insane. Of course, the flip side is if anyone gets near Mission, she'll be out of combat almost instantly. Mission's primary value is her proficiency in skills. I've said a few times in this video that skills don't matter, and that's because of party members like Mission. Mission is proficient in a good number of skills, and she has a high intelligence, so she gets a lot of skill points each level. She has enough skill points to level up skills she's not proficient in while still being the best of anyone in your party. This means Mission can pick locks, defuse bombs, detect traps, and hack computers. She's the party member equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, and I tend to keep her in my party more frequently than not. I really like Mission, and I think it's because she fits my description of what makes players fond of specific characters. Mission's access to skills means she has an obvious mechanical function. Every time Mission unlocks a door, repairs a droid, or hacks a computer, it reinforces she's a useful character. I like keeping her around for this reason. This paves the way to create an attachment to her story, which you'll gain very quickly through dialogues that appear while she's in your party. If you do gain an attachment to Mission, then you'll also gain a greater attachment to the story on Taris. The storyline about swoop gangs in the lower city can feel very far from the Jedi adventure most players signed up for. You might feel disconnected from the game because of that. However, if you care about Mission, then the situation is different. What happens to these gangs will impact Mission's character, so you feel more invested, not because you care about the gangs, but because you care more about Mission. With Mission in your party, you can explore the rest of the Undercity. From the village gate, you can choose to go left, right, or straight, and these 3 branching paths illustrate how the Undercity feels redundant and unnecessary. The straight path is where you'll find Bastila's crashed escape pod. This is what you came down here for in the first place, but by now you already have all the information you need. Gadon has already told you the escape pod was found by the Vulkars and Bastila has been kidnapped. If you decide to explore the pod anyway, you'll find an NPC who tells you the escape pod was found by the Vulkars and Bastila has been kidnapped. The left path will have you run into Canderous again. This time his crew is getting attacked by rat ghouls and you can help defend against them. In exchange for helping him out, he'll talk to you a little bit about what he's doing on Taris. The most significant information you can learn here is the dynamic between the lower city gangs and a character named Davik. You may have come across some information about Davik by talking to NPCs or Mission, but Canderous works for Davik, so he isn't speculating on his role, he actually knows what's going on. It's easy to think Davik and the swoop gangs are all criminals, so they must all be related, but there's an additional layer of importance for Davik's crew.
What are you, an off-worlder? Everyone knows Davik. He's a member of the Exchange. You know, the Interstellar Crime Syndicate.
Canderous works for Davik, as does Calo Nord. The Exchange will continue to be relevant for the rest of the game because they have a galactic presence, whereas the swoop gangs do not. Gadon and the Bex, or his counterpart at the Vulkars, are Taris factions exclusive to the prologue. The similarities and distinction between these criminal factions are one of the ways the Taris prologue begins to introduce major narrative elements of the main story. Taris is meant to be a self-contained prologue, but to be a successful prologue, it needs to plant seeds that remain relevant for the rest of the story. The Exchange is the bridge that links the prologue to the main plot, as we'll see later on. Canderous will also advise you not to bother salvaging anything from the escape pods because the Vulkars already found them and kidnapped Bastila, but you already knew that because Gadon told you this in the lower city. The right path will lead you to a Sith patrol squad. This squad will tell you, stop me if you've heard this before, the escape pods were found by the Vulkars. This is now the 4th time you've received the same information, and 3 of those instances happened in the Undercity. The Sith will complain about the rat ghouls, but they'll include a valuable piece of information. Apparently, the Sith squads have been provided a rat ghoul serum. This is likely the cure Zelka said he would give to the public, or his assistant said you could sell for credits. You might be tempted to attack this squad to get the serum, but as they said, they ran out of it. You'll actually find the serum on a Sith soldier corpse just past where you encounter the squad. Once you pick up this serum, you have an unlimited supply to resolve multiple multiple quests, although you can't sell the cure and then later give it to Zelka. The other side quest related to this cure is in the Undercity village. There are a group of quarantined villagers who you can cure. If you decide to backtrack and do this, the villagers' reward for your kindness is by telling you the location of Bastila's escape pod. This is especially dumb because not only is this the 5th time you've received this information, but there's no way to get the serum to receive this dialogue in the first place without walking past the escape pod. Whether you choose to go straight, left, or right, you'll find an entrance to the sewers, which is often lumped together with the Undercity. Personally, I think the Undercity is distinct from the sewers because I don't have an issue with the sewers. When it comes to making recommendations for a remake of Knights of the Old Republic, I am mostly a purist. Knights of the Old Republic is already a great game. It's just a little dated. It doesn't need fundamental changes. However, if there was any area of the game I would cut from the remake, it would be the Terrace Undercity. It feels like the part of the KOTOR design doc that didn't get proofread before the creative team started generating assets. It is a completely redundant area. Every character we meet in the Undercity has either already been introduced or is never seen again. The only unique quest in the Undercity is the Promised Land Journals, which feels out of place for the Star Wars brand. And since it requires backtracking, I don't think most people complete it anyway. You could replace the lower city elevator to the Undercity with a grate that goes directly to the sewers without losing anything. The one thing you would have to rewrite is how Mission joins your party, but I think that presents an opportunity to make her a stronger character. I'll talk about that at the end of this chapter. The point is, I think you could remove the entirety of the Undercity without losing anything of value. If nothing else, it would shorten the Terrace prologue, which I think everyone would be fine with. The sewers are what I would consider the first dungeon environment in Knights of the Old Republic. Unlike most dungeons in Knights of the Old Republic, this one is purely combat. There are no smaller interactions of any kind. There are 3 types of enemies in this area. There are the Rat Ghouls, Gamorrean Slavers, and a Sith Patrol. The Sith Patrol is especially difficult because they're the first enemies to utilize the shields you learned about at the very beginning of Terrace. Any blaster damage will be directed to the shield, which can absorb a minimum of 20 points of damage. I think I fought these guys for a solid 4 minutes in one of my playthroughs and used more than 10 med packs. It's pretty silly, but it's an optional fight, so it makes sense it's difficult. There's no real tactic for exploring the sewers. You can wander aimlessly, and eventually you'll find the room where Zalbar is being held. He is next to a room full of Gamorreans. There's actually 2 different ways to enter this room, but this is an example of how KOTOR's alternative playstyles feel like an afterthought. The designers went through the trouble to make a second entrance that requires security skill checks to pass through, but entering through one door versus the other provides no meaningful advantage. In fact, forget about advantage, there's no meaningful difference between these 2 doors. There's no droid or computer panel or anything. You either open one door or the other. After you dispatch the Gamorreans, Mission will open the door to Zalbar. Zalbar says he's deeply affected by your actions and swears a life debt to you on the spot.
A life debt? You sure about that, Big Z? Think about it carefully. Better be sure about this. Big Z swearing a Wookiee life debt to you? Wow, this is major. A life debt is the most solemn vow a Wookiee can make. It means he'll stay by your side for the rest of your life. Wherever you go, whatever you do, Zalbar will be with you.
This is another way of saying Zalbar is in your party now. I've always thought Zalbar's life debt was a cheap way to get 2 people into your party. Helping a guy who was imprisoned for less than 2 hours seems like a very low bar for swearing a life debt. I like the concept of your character getting a Wookiee companion through a life debt, but I think the stakes that resulted in this life debt are way too low in this circumstance. It also makes Mission's character more passive because despite claiming Big Z isn't her babysitter, she only sticks around to be with Zalbar.
I guess this means you're stuck with me, too. Wherever Big Z goes, I'm going.
This is something I think should be rewritten in the remake. More on that later. As a party member, Zalbar is fairly passive. He's the strong but silent type. He is pitched as a package deal with Mission, and the 2 complement each other both mechanically and narratively. Zalbar's greatest contribution is how he functions in combat. Despite his scout classification, he plays like a bruiser. He has an incredible 20 strength and constitution, so he can deal a ton of damage and tank a lot of hits. This is balanced out with his inability to wear any armor, so he doesn't get any defense bonuses. weaknesses. The game provides a lot of lore reasons for why Wookiees don't wear armor, but I think it's really because they didn't want to resize the textures for his taller character model. He's not the tankiest party member in the game, but he can hold his own on the front line. Once again, the starting weapon for this party member can lead you astray. Zaalbar starts with a ranged bowcaster, but he's much better off with a melee weapon. In fact, you're probably better off giving Mission's vibroblade to Zaalbar and Zaalbar's bowcaster to Mission. Big Z's high strength makes him more useful as a melee combatant, and it lets him be the perfect frontline distraction to allow Mission to shoot enemies in the back. When both characters are in your party, combat can go pretty smoothly, assuming you're only dealing with swords and blasters. In terms of narrative contributions, Zaalbar doesn't talk much. He has one of the fewest lines of dialogue of all your party members, and most of those lines only occur when Mission is around.
Hey, Big Z, don't take this the wrong way, but lately, I've noticed you're starting to look a little bit scruffy. No, I'm not suggesting a bath. I know how well that went over last time. But your hair's getting all tangled. And if you look close, you can see a few gray strands starting to poke through.
Outside of his companionship with Mission, Big Z is basically mute. He does have two meaningful contributions to the story, including potentially the most significant moral choice in the entire game, but he's not one of my favorite party members because he doesn't add much. With Zaalbar in your party, you'll have to decide who's coming with you to the Vulkar base. Mission has to come with you to the Vulkar base, but you can choose to keep Carth or swap him out for Big Z. If there was ever a time to pick Zaalbar, it's right now. He can have unique dialogue lines with Mission, and perhaps more importantly, he doesn't stop you from making any dark side decisions. Carth will occasionally prevent dark side options while on Taris, so if you're doing a Sith playthrough, it can be annoying. You'll still get the alignment points, but you just won't literally do the evil thing. You're better off with Zaalbar and seeing his chemistry with Mission. With Zaalbar rescued, Mission will hold up her end of the bargain. She'll guide you past the force field where you can get into the Vulkar base, but there's a new problem. The back entrance is defended by a Rancor. I want you to remember this Rancor when we wrap up Taris at the end of this chapter. Its presence creates a connection to the original Star Wars trilogy that would otherwise not be possible elsewhere in the game. Defeating the Rancor isn't difficult, but it is one of the clunkier mechanics in Knights of the Old Republic. Just outside the Rancor's door is a severed arm with a datapad and some synthesized odor. The datapad explains you can get past the Rancor by placing the odor on an item that will kill the creature. This will allow you to pass without issue. Personally, I don't understand how this datapad exists. There's only one Rancor, so if someone did this before, shouldn't it be dead already? Whatever. You'll need to loot the corpse pile in the room with the Rancor, then click the switch to give item option, which will allow you to take any item in your inventory and place the synthesized odor along with any explosive like a grenade or mine. This will trigger a cutscene of the Rancor exploding to death. This is literally the only time in the entire game you have to use this mechanic, and it's not intuitive game design. The game never teaches you how to do this. You just have to figure it out, which was common for CRPGs at the time. This sequence brought to you by 2003 Game Design. Personally, when I think of a remake for Knights of the Old Republic, I think of sequences like this Rancor scene. This is an example of the difference between difficulty and inaccessibility. It's not difficult to kill the Rancor. Once you know how, it's very easy. But if you don't know about this mechanic, which is the game's fault for not teaching you about it, then it's easy to get stuck. A remake could remove these clunky mechanics and make them more modern without fundamentally changing the game. And in case you're curious, you can't simply attack the Rancor. He will kill you so fast you don't even see the animation. The back entrance gets you into the Vulkar base, and I would consider this the first real explorable area in Knights of the Old Republic. I've referred to these areas as dungeons because KOTOR relies a lot on D&D, and Dungeons & Dragons is generally divided into two major concepts: dungeons and dragons? Wait. The two major concepts of Dungeons & Dragons are role-playing and combat. Town hubs are where you perform role-playing, like receiving quests, forming relationships with NPCs, or buying things. Dungeons are where you are predominantly in combat or rely on skill checks to do things, like scale cliffs or solve puzzles. For lack of a better term, the Vulkar base is a dungeon. Similar to the Endar Spire, there are different paths you can take through this environment, but also similar to the Endar Spire, the only real path is to hit things a lot. I've said said a few times how KOTOR is a game focused on combat, and the Volker base is a good example of what I mean by that. There are attempts at providing alternative playstyles, but they're not viable paths for completing the area. For example, at the beginning of this area, you'll start in a back hallway with a series of doors on opposite sides. If the game was actually designed with alternative playstyles in mind, there would be some way to explore this environment without triggering combat, whether that's through some foresight mechanic or a clearly defined duck system to avoid being seen. If you want to avoid combat in the Volker base, there is exactly one door available to you, and there's no way of knowing that your first time playing the game. One of the doors on the south side of the hallway has a defunct droid. You can use your repair skill to refit spare parts and give this droid better weapons, better shields, and better targeting. You may recall you performed an identical action to a droid on the Endar Spire. Your experience in the tutorial may suggest Knights of the Old Republic will be littered with droids that can take care of combat for you, but that's not the case. Most droids in the game are like this one, and they all share the same problems. The first problem is you don't even know it's there. KOTOR frequently places these droids in locations you wouldn't know about unless you had played the game already. In fact, if you've played the game, you'll know we've already passed 2 examples of this in the Lower City and the Undercity. It's more likely you'll find a droid after you've already cleared an area. The second problem is droids require repair parts just to initiate their patrol pattern. Without initiating the patrol pattern, the droid will not move. You could potentially dump parts into repairing functions, such as shields or weapons, just to have it sit there not doing anything. The patrol pattern is also typically the most expensive repair. This is true for every droid in KOTOR, and it's terrible game design. The final and most egregious problem is the droid solution is often useless. In this example, the patrol pattern for the droid is a joke. The droid will patrol the hallway, but it won't explore the rooms where there are actual bad guys. In one of my playthroughs, I watched this droid aimlessly walk back and forth in the background while I fought guys. It can be very frustrating to know your repair parts were used for nothing, especially since there are a predefined number of repair parts you can find in the game. It's not something you can just generate at a workbench. There's actually another great example of these droid problems within the Volker base. You'll find a room with an empty swimming pool and a locker box at the bottom. You may be tempted to open the locker box, but the pool is booby-trapped with gas mines. The game provides a solution with a small droid that can be reprogrammed to walk through the gas mines, thereby sacrificing itself for your benefit. That might sound nice, but you can also turn on solo mode, walk one of your party members into the mines, then use an antidote kit and cure the poison. You could also just watch them die and heal them when they get back up. It's a silly puzzle, and unsurprisingly, we never see anything like it for the rest of the game. In general, droids in KOTOR are out of sight, too expensive, and whatever problem they solve can be accomplished in some other way. In the context of a remake, this whole system needs a redo, because its current implementation is useless more often than not. Personally, when I replay KOTOR, I don't even bother with the droids, and I don't think I'm the only one. The examples in the Volker base feel like the developers made the game in sequential order, and this was their first attempt at providing alternative playstyles. After Terrace, we see less and less of these options, and that's probably a good thing. Knights of the Old Republic isn't a mechanically dense game with multiple playstyles. This is a game about combat. You have a lot of variation within the combat, but you're not going to stealth archer your way to the end credits. The role of a Star Wars hero is one who fights bad guys a lot, and that's fine. People like KOTOR because it gives a Star Wars experience, not because it competes with Deus Ex or other immersive sims. Regardless of the complaints I have about the droids, the Volker base is a decent expression of Knights of the Old Republic's focus on narrative elements like world building. The Volker base actually feels like a place where gang members hang out. There's a lounge area with a bartender, and there's also a waitress who's unaffiliated with the Volkers. You can question her about her involvement and choose what happens to her for indirectly benefiting a criminal organization. From a gameplay perspective, there is no combat challenge to fighting an unarmed barkeep, but the benefit to the player is it makes the world feel more real. These flourishes add to the game's atmosphere and distinguish it as a Star Wars RPG rather than any other dozens of action games in the same universe. Your objective in the Volker base is to acquire a maintenance keycard and to get to the lower level where you can obtain the swoop bike accelerator. If you're playing the standard version of the game, you'll likely trip into one of these cards and get downstairs without issue. If you have the restored content mod installed, there's an entire second floor where you learn more about the Volker operation. The second floor is decent additional content, but it's easy to understand why it was cut. The majority of the second floor is made up of 10 different rooms that contain nothing but small-scale combat encounters. There's even a patrol of Volkers who will spawn behind you after you open open a couple doors. It's combat with even more combat, which the game really didn't need after the entire sewer section, which is all combat, not to mention the remainder of the Volker base, which is even more combat. You'll gain a lot of experience fighting guys on the second floor, but it feels tedious when you've had 4 combat encounters in a row and there's another 6 to go. Oddly enough, the droid on the second floor is much more useful than the one you find on the first floor, or honestly anywhere else in the game. Although it is funny, the best droid in the game is within content that was cut. This one actually patrols into bad guys and it can tear them up pretty good. If you choose to grind your way to the second floor's drug lab, you'll defeat a Gamorrean who drops a battle axe, which is a pretty solid early game item. I personally equipped this on Zalbar and let him channel his bestial rage. The battle axe is nice, but you don't need to grind through all this combat to progress. You can grab a maintenance card from one of the first rooms and leave without too much trouble. The second floor is another example of how the quote restored content of KOTOR isn't vital for enjoying the game. The vanilla version is great on its own. After this is the Volker basement. The Volker basement always feels intimidating because it gives the impression of a third dungeon after the sewers and the first floor, but it's effectively only 3 rooms. It will end with a confrontation with a Twi'lek named Kandin. Before you initiate combat, Kandin will talk to the party, questioning your allegiance to the Becks. He targets Mission specifically and tells her the Becks never took her seriously. Some players might see Kandin's offer as a stereotypical dark side option, but the implementation of this choice is very smart. It's smart because the moral quandary isn't about what you want to do, but rather how you want to influence Mission's character. Mission is the only person who really cares about the swoop gangs. Her relationship with the gangs is tied to the insecurity she has about her age and her ability to trust other people. Kandin's appeal to Mission plays directly into these insecurities, and his argument isn't really evil. It's actually pretty understandable.
Mana tota. Aku jigratuk bola. Jishok Jonatong Jongking no una pangpa mulira kun kili.
They said I was too young.
Shagjikin lor chawata uma. Kavavulpa mulji gumana.
Mission is a high-value individual who isn't being appreciated. Why be loyal to people who don't take you seriously? Mission indicates as much in her response. She doesn't disavow her loyalty to the Becks, but her response suggests you can choose to help either faction without suffering a penalty to your relationship with her. You, the player, only care about this choice because you're invested in Mission's character. What you decide to do will shape how you view her story. I should be clear and say you're not literally deciding between 2 branching paths in her character development. Knights of the Old Republic isn't a game that radically alters its story based on your choices. In fact, I think anyone who's played games for the past decade should know no game is ever going to do that. Well, other than Alpha Protocol and Witcher 2, I guess. It's common knowledge all choice-based quest design follows a diamond outline. You may be able to divert through the middle, but ultimately the quest will resolve in the same way. Some people react negatively to this reality. Critics argue the lack of a meaningful mechanical difference makes the choice pointless, or even worse, deceives the player into believing they have agency. Once the player discovers the deception, it takes them out of the experience. I sympathize with this viewpoint, because I was also disappointed when Mass Effect 3 came out and completely invalidated every major decision in the franchise. But it's not fair to say the choices don't matter at all. When you make a choice in a video game, your decision is an extension of your experience with the game. You already have a relationship with Mission's character, and what you're deciding here is to select for what aspect of her character is most relevant to your experience. This choice between the Becks and the Volkers is asking some meaningful questions about Mission. Does Mission trust people, or does she have reason to only trust herself? Is she a loyal character, or has she become a cynic? Choosing to side with the Becks suggests Mission maintains her trust in others when it's challenged. Choosing to side with the Volkers suggests Mission can't trust the Becks on their word. Either option will spotlight a different side of Mission's character. Maybe she is cynical, or maybe she's loyal. Either interpretation is legitimate, and her character will remain narratively coherent either way. In fact, what you decide here can alter if you view Mission's character arc as one of linear development or something more tragic. This is what I mean when I say the choice is an extension of the player. You are deciding how you view Mission's character. I believe this is a substantive decision each player makes in their game. I know most people don't see it that way because people fixate on the lack of mechanical consequence, but I don't think that's totally fair or even accurate to how people experience games. All that said, it is true that from a plot perspective, whether you choose to side with the Becks or the Vulkars makes no difference. In either instance, you'll be using the swoop bike accelerator to compete in the race. From a gameplay perspective, you're only choosing if you want to fight Kandin and his flunkies right now, or go back to the Beck base and kill Gadon. The difficulty of each encounter is identical, but it's probably easier to betray the Becks than it is to fight Kandin. The only reason for the difficulty difference is if you fight Kandin, you're ending a multi-hour combat session with one of the most difficult encounters. Whereas if you side with Kandin, you get escorted out of the base and you can go buy as many med packs and shields as you want before raiding the Beck base. If you do choose to betray the Becks, you'll run into another instance of KOTOR's limited playstyles. Once you get to the base, you'll see Gadon is no longer on the ground floor. You can only interact with Zerdra, who references an assassin maybe trying to kill Gadon. Zerdra's dialogue might suggest there's an opportunity to stealthily kill Gadon, but there's not. All the doors in the Beck base are locked. You can't use your security skill to open them either. If you open them the regular way, then you get a prompt about a security breach. This breach alerts the entire base and you'll have to fight your way out. Even after you slaughter the entire Beck base and make your way to Gadon, there's another opportunity to try to convince Gadon and his bodyguard you're a friendly. But in my experience, this persuasion check always fails.
Liar. The guards would have announced you. Gadon, we've been betrayed again. We're under attack. Guards! Guards!
It's disappointing because the game seems to indicate different playstyles by referencing assassins and providing a persuade option. But those options are, for whatever reason, not fleshed out to viability. Maybe there's an ambition to make an assassination a possibility, but they never got the time to finish it. Whatever you decide, you'll never see Gadon or Kandin ever again, and in either outcome, you'll be brought to the racetrack for the competition. When you arrive at the racetrack, you'll get an introduction to the concept of swoop racing. This is a side activity you can partake in at various points throughout the game. I didn't understand the inclusion of swoop racing when I first played this game, but I think there's two motivating factors for this minigame. The first reason is what I'd shorthand as the Quidditch effect, but I'll talk about that in a later video. The other reason is the influence video game reviews once had on the industry. In the 2000s era of video game design, there was a frequent critique of games that relied too heavily on one mechanic. I remember reading GameSpot and EGM reviews that criticized games like God of War or Max Payne for being too action-focused, as if that was somehow a bad thing. Lots of games tried to circumvent this ding to their review score by diversifying their mechanics with ancillary minigames. Think of games like Assassin's Creed and its litany of side activities, or the original Gears of War and its variety of novelty enemies like the Berserker or Exploding Wretches. These variations to a game's core appeal was meant to appease the ongoing complaints from reviewers, and I don't think it benefited anyone. In retrospect, it's bizarre this critique ever took hold. I think it was the result of some mind virus inflicted on Games Press, who were inundated by talking points from bigger developers. Companies like Square Enix or Rockstar, who were so massive they could afford to fill their products with random stuff that was never the central appeal of their games. If Final Fantasy can have Blitzball and Grand Theft Auto can have pizza deliveries, shouldn't Knights of the Old Republic have a pod racer ripoff? That was the game designers had to play when KOTOR was released. Thankfully, swoop racing isn't that bad, but I'm pretty certain it was only implemented to avoid this critique, and maybe launch a spin-off property for the Star Wars brand.
Now this is pod racing.
The mechanics of swoop racing are incredibly simple. There's only 3 buttons you can press: accelerate, veer left, and veer right. That's it. You can't even brake if you wanted to. As your bike gets faster, it will shift into higher gears, which you can trigger by letting go of the acceleration and pressing it down again once the meter fills up. Veering left and right is done only to move over speed pads that boost your acceleration or to avoid obstacles that slow you down. No race is designed to be longer than 30 seconds, and generally you want your time to be somewhere between 22 seconds and 32 seconds. This is incredibly doable because you can race in a straight line, hitting every obstacle along the way and still clear that time. You'll race the same track multiple times to get successfully faster scores. There isn't much strategy, it's just a matter of memorization. You generally want to move your bike as little as possible. If you're trying to hit 2 speed pads that are on opposite sides of the track, that's a bad tactic because there is a high chance of error. Before you start the swoop competition, you'll have the opportunity to talk to other racers or see Bastila locked in her cage. I always found this visual kind of silly. I think they were trying to evoke Princess Leia in Jabba's palace, but it seems like a dramatic departure from the game's tone to suddenly have a scantily clad lady locked inside a literal cage. It's an odd visual, but it does a good job to focus your attention on the objective of this section of the game. Otherwise, you might notice this racetrack is remarkably similar to the lower city walkways, with 1 or 2 artifacts to make it it look different. Whenever you decide to start the swoop competition, your first run needs to be shorter than 38 seconds to rank at all. No matter how fast you are, your first score will always be beaten by another racer and you'll have to do another run. It may actually benefit you to do a bad job in the first run and actually try the second time. In my experience, if your second run is faster than 24 seconds, then you'll be crowned victor of the tournament. If for some reason you're having difficulty with this, your bike will become progressively faster with each additional attempt. But after 6 attempts, the bike will explode and you'll get a game over. I don't know anyone who's naturally come across this problem, but I guess it is technically possible. When the competition ends, Brejik will finally appear and announce a change of plans. He explains he originally believed Bastila was just a Republic officer, but now he's found out that she's actually a Jedi.
Obviously, I can't turn her over to you. It would be far too dangerous to have a Jedi as a slave. But rest assured, I'll find some other way to compensate you for your victory.
Before we keep going, I want to introduce a segment I'll arbitrarily deploy throughout this series. Knights of the Old Republic has an incredible mix of semi-famous voice actors. These actors have reappeared in other BioWare properties or video game-adjacent beloved media, and I've always found it a neat little treat to figure out where I recognize someone's voice. The first instance of this in KOTOR is... well, the first instance is probably Karth, who is the same voice actor as another BioWare party member, which most people should know. But besides Karth, the first example of a semi-famous voice actor in KOTOR is Brejik. He's been in a lot of other video games, but I think his most prominent role is the voiceover he did for one of the Studio Ghibli films.
Obviously, I can't turn her over to you. It would be far too dangerous to have a Jedi as a slave.
You shouldn't be here. Get out of here, now!
What?
It's almost night. Leave before it gets dark.
Do you know which one it is? BioWare knows how to redeploy voice actors, so this won't be the last time we hear his voice. In fact, it's not even the first time we've heard his voice in this video. I'll let you figure out what other character he played. I'll bring this game up a few times throughout the video series. Maybe someone in the comments can provide an answer sheet. Brejik's plan to keep Bastila enslaved doesn't go so well.
What? Impossible. You were restrained by a neural disruptor! How could you have possibly summoned the will to free yourself?
You underestimate the strength of a Jedi's mind, Brejik. A mistake you won't live to regret.
The two of you team up to take down Brejik and his gang members. After the battle, you'll get to speak with Bastila for the first time. Bastila is arguably the most consequential character in all of Knights of the Old Republic. She's on the box art, she has the most spoken lines, she's the first Jedi you meet, she is the MacGuffin for the beginning of the story, and her battle meditation ability is integral to the game's narrative. This is a character you'll spend most of the game with, so your first impression of her is pretty important. She'll recognize you from the Endar Spire and ask how you managed to race for the swoop gangs. No matter what option you pick, you'll eventually imply you saved Bastila, which elicits this response.
Save me? Is that what you were trying to accomplish by riding in that swoop race? Well, as far as rescues go, this is a pretty poor example. In case you hadn't noticed, I managed to free myself from that neural restraint collar without your help. In fact, it's more accurate to say that I saved you. Brejik and his Vulkars would have left you for dead if I hadn't stepped into that fight. You're lucky I was here to get you out of this mess.
Bastila comes across as overtly proud and easy to provoke. This is already not a flattering first impression. And if you're familiar with Star Wars lore, you'll know it is intensely weird for a Jedi to act like this. You'll manage to talk past the slight on her pride, but when you get back to the terrace apartment, things get worse.
Now that I'm back in charge of this mission, perhaps we can start doing things properly. Hopefully our escape from Terrace will go more smoothly than when you rescued me from Brejik.
I know you're new at this, Bastila, but a leader doesn't berate her troops just because things aren't going as planned. Don't let your ego get in the way of the real issues here.
That hardly strikes me as an appropriate way of addressing your commander, Karth. I am a member of the Jedi Order, and this is my mission. Don't forget that.
Bastila's ego is out of control, and while we all deal with personality faults, an uncontrolled ego mixed with incredible force powers is something Star Wars fans know to be wary of. The game reminds you of this dangerous combination by giving you another vision of Bastila fighting Darth Revan just before this argument in the apartment. You can choose to diffuse or antagonize the situation, and if you're having trouble deciding who's right and who's wrong, remember Bastila has a British accent, and we all know how BioWare feels about British people.
Pronounce this word.
Ah!
No, governor!
It's clear from your first interaction, Bastila isn't a stereotypical Jedi. This isn't always obvious because of the limitations of graphics capabilities in 2003, but Bastila is meant to be a very young Jedi. Her attitude and accent puts on airs of maturity, but when you meet her on Taris, she's not even 21 years old. Her character is meant to be inexperienced and overly prideful. Her battle meditation has thrusted her into a position of power, but she doesn't understand the weight of that responsibility. This is obvious during this initial interaction with her, and that first impression has a lasting effect on how you view her character. This argument with Bastila is a good reminder of how dialogue options impact your experience with the game, even if there is no mechanical consequence. Whether you side with Carth or Bastila won't change the plot of the game. What it changes is your personal relationship with these characters. Choosing to reprimand Bastila for her poor leadership has a consequence on how you understand her character, in the same way that choosing to side with Carth has a consequence on how you understand his character, or how being diplomatic has a consequence on how you understand your own character. You, the player, form a personal relationship with these characters, and the game enables that relationship through its dialogue options. Though if you're only watching this video, you're mostly getting my interpretation of these characters. On my first playthrough, I played the diplomat, but in subsequent playthroughs, I typically tell Bastila she's being a baby.
Yes, you're right, of course. I apologize, Carth. This has been a difficult time for me. Of course, I'm happy to listen to your advice.
Despite the disagreement, both Carth and Bastila agree you need to formulate a plan to get off Taris. It's not clear how you'll accomplish that, but you have no choice but to venture out back into the upper city. Before you head out, Bastila will talk to you directly. She says you look unwell, and she's referring to the second vision you received of her fighting Darth Revan in the events preceding the beginning of the game. You can choose to ignore the conversation, but if you do talk to Bastila, she will make the suggestion your visions are the result of her power.
I'm not sure. It may be that you have some connection to the Force. It would not be unheard of. When we first met, your natural talent may have fed off my own Force abilities.
She explains Force-sensitive individuals can sometimes sense one another, which is another way of suggesting your character is Force-sensitive. Obviously, this isn't really a big surprise to anyone playing a Star Wars game. Oh, really? The main character of a Star Wars game? Force-sensitive? Would have never guessed. The reveal of your Force sensitivity is more interesting than this cliché, because your Force sensitivity is tied to your relationship with Bastila. You'll be asked to navigate your relationship with her as the game progresses. I think this bond with Bastila is the game's way of exporting your character's moral dilemmas to something more tangible. Struggling to do the right thing while resisting the temptations of corrupt power is a human problem, but it's difficult to depict in a video game like Knights of the Old Republic. Just pick the good option is the extent of the dilemma for most video games. The solution is easy because your character is presented as a blank slate, and whether you're good or evil doesn't really impact your character. By making the player character bonded to Bastila, the game has effectively exported the moral quandaries to her and made you responsible for her character arc. I think this is a smart decision because it makes your navigation of moral questions within the story more compelling and creates investment in Bastila's character arc. This is also why I think playing as a male character is more compelling than playing as a female character. I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Knights of the Old Republic has romance options, and unsurprisingly, these options are the first two human characters you meet in the game. If you're playing as a female, you can romance Carth, and if you're playing as a male, you can romance Bastila. This should already be evident if you're playing the game because your first interaction with either of these characters includes very obvious flirtatious remarks. This is also why I think playing as a male character is more compelling than playing as a female character. I think the romance with Bastila is more compelling than the one with Carth because it's more naturally woven into the main plot. Your character's relationship with Bastila is integral to your Force powers, as well as all the other major institutions in the narrative, such as the Jedi Council. You don't get that with the Carth storyline, but we'll explore that more later. You now have enough companions to select who to bring with you and who to leave behind. So it's time to start an official ranking of party members. Cue the music. I'm ranking companions on 3 criteria: combat ability, skills, and narrative significance. We'll update these ratings as things change. At the very bottom of the list, we have Zalbar. He is the most plagiaristic character in the game because he is effectively Chewbacca with a backstory. Despite this easy copy-paste character, Zalbar has a whole lot of nothing to do in the early parts of the game. He has the second fewest dialogue options of all the party members, and most of them already happened by this point in the game. If you didn't take Zalbar with you to the Vulcar base, you won't be hearing from Big Z until a little bit later into the game. Zalbar also has pretty unremarkable skills, so there's nothing to save him there. He does have an impressive combat ability with his base 20 strength, but the appeal is diminished by the fact you can't equip armor. One of the best things about KOTOR is getting cool loot, so you could say keeping Zalbar around reduces your enjoyment of the game by 33%. Honestly, I don't know if I've ever used Zalbar outside of when I was forced to. He's not a bad character, he's just not a remarkable party companion. The remaining party members are all pretty good, including Carth, who's next on the list. Right now, Carth is suspicious of your character, but as I talked about earlier, his distrust makes the story more interesting. I think his presence adds to the game most of the time, especially at this point in the game because he won't stop you from doing bad things anymore. But Carth will continue to have something to say at most major plot points in the story. Beyond his narrative significance, Carth's skills may be bare bones, but his combat is decent. He defaults to dual blasters, but he's just as effective as a melee brawler who can be on the front line if you're too flimsy to tank things yourself. Next we have Mission, who is personally my favorite companion in the game. I personally enjoy her character arc, which we'll see more of soon, and she has the second most skills of all the party members. This means Mission is essential for unlocking optional content throughout the game. She can pick any lock, repair any droid, hack any computer, and defuse any mine she comes across. In terms of combat, Mission will almost certainly get body slammed by most enemies, but she can be an incredible damage dealer thanks to her sneak attack, as long as you keep the bad guys off her. The only reason I don't use Mission in my party is if there are two other party members with better narrative significance for the current planet I'm on, or if I'm already playing as a scoundrel and don't need to rely on her skills to get through the game. Finally, the number one spot for right now is Bastila. Bastila may have given a bad first impression, but she's still the best party member in the game at this point. She has strong narrative significance, she has decent skills, and there's one other thing in her favor, I forget what it was. Oh yes. She's a Jedi! She uses space magic to boomerang a double-sided lightsaber at her enemies, which is really interesting because I don't think anyone ever did that in the movies. People play Star Wars games because Jedi are cool, so unsurprisingly, Bastila is a common favorite. Beyond the aesthetic appeal of her character, Bastila's greatest mechanical contribution is she can also heal your party with force points. This means you never have to use medpacks again, which vastly improves the quality of life of playing the game. For that reason alone, I would pick her in my party every time for the rest of Taris. Given these rankings, I usually keep Bastila and Mission with me at this point in the game. If you have a weaker main character, you may want Carth and Zalbar to tank damage. There are enough options that you can balance your own character's strengths with the other party members, which is the whole point of party members. BioWare did a good job diversifying your companion's skill set so you can balance out your weaknesses with their strengths. Once you leave the Taris apartment, you'll be approached by a guy who says Canderous wants to speak with you. We've met Canderous a few times at this point and know enough about him to find his offer intriguing. You'll meet up with him in the Upper City Cantina. The conversation with Canderous is a good example of how party members can have more or less narrative relevance. When you speak to Canderous, you can potentially hear a comment from one of your party members.
I need someone I know can get the job done to help me. That's where you come in.
Careful. Mercs like this haven't a lick of conscience. They'll betray you in a heartbeat. This could be a trap.
I ain't talking to you. I'm talking to your friend, aren't I?
The only exception to this is Zalbar, who, as you'll come to discover, rarely has anything to say. The other three party members do have a comment to make, but you can only bring two, so I guess you'll have to replay the game to see the other one. Canderous wants to work with you to get off of Taris for good, and he has a plan to do it, but he needs your help. Canderous has access to a ship that can fly off Taris, but there's a problem. The planet is under a Sith lockdown, so only ships that have been pre-approved can leave the atmosphere without getting incinerated by heavy weaponry.
I need someone to steal the Sith launch codes from the base. Without those codes, any ship leaving the atmosphere will be disintegrated by the Sith fleet's automated defense guns.
Canderous wants you to break into the Sith base and get the launch codes that will allow for a ship to leave the planet. After that's accomplished, Canderous will get your party access to a ship called the Ebon Hawk so you can fly off Taris. Carth and Bastila express distrust in Canderous's intentions, but he reaffirms he benefits from the plan as much as you do, because it allows him to leave Taris as well. You can express some hesitation, but ultimately this is the only plan you have, so you're forced to go with it. Breaking into the Sith base requires getting a droid Canderous has reserved at a droid shop in the Upper City. If you have Mission with you on your way to the droid shop, you'll be prompted to speak with her about how she ended up on Taris. You can actually get this dialogue exchange the moment Mission joins your party, but the section just before the Sith base is when the game reminds you to check in with her. This is a good placement for the reminder because at this point in the story, Mission doesn't have an immediate relevance to the story anymore. You're done with the swoop gangs, so why is this teenager still hanging around? Well, other than her attachment to Zalbar. When you speak to Mission, the conversation will begin with how she met up with Zalbar in the first place. Your initial conversation will conclude with Mission making an offhanded remark about her brother.
My brother's a touchy subject, you know. It just so happens I don't really feel like talking about him right now. Nothing personal. Let's just get back to the business at hand, okay?
Mission will decline to provide more details at first, but later she explains she was raised by her older brother, Griff.
I never knew my parents. My brother always looked out for me. He's the one who brought me here to Taris. I was just a kid, only 5, but I remember the trip. If you could call it that. We were stuffed inside a packing crate in the Starfreighter's cargo hold with just enough food and water to make the trip. Not exactly first class, you know. I don't know the whole story. I was pretty young, but my brother owed a lot of money. Might even have been a few arrest warrants out for him, I don't know. The only way to get off the planet was to smuggle ourselves out. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like we were criminals. Well, maybe my brother was. See, this is why I don't like to talk about it. It makes Griff sound worse than he really was. My brother had his problems, but he always looked out for me. He gambled and drank, and he was always borrowing money for his latest get-rich-quick scheme. But he had a good heart, you know? He taught me how to survive.
Griff was apparently the type of guy who finds success in the criminal underworld. He was a smooth talker who knew his way around tech like computer slicing or placing mines, so he could instill a sense of confidence in his ability. It was through Griff Mission learned all of her skills, but Griff had his problems. He developed a gambling habit, a drinking habit, and worst of all, a relationship with a woman named Lena.
It's all Lena's fault. She's the one who took him from me. Just batted those long lashes at him and off he went.
Griff and Lena started dating, and Mission says Lena consumed her brother. Griff isn't in the picture anymore, and Mission says it's because Lena convinced her brother to abandon her. According to Mission, Lena said Griff couldn't support his girlfriend and his sister at the same time. Mission says this is what convinced Griff to leave Taris with Lena and pursue opportunities elsewhere. This detail reveals Mission, much like Carth, has experienced an event that has altered her worldview. That event was a betrayal. However, unlike Carth, Mission's response to this betrayal is very different. The first major difference is Mission's relationship to the person who betrayed her. Griff is the one who chose to leave Taris, but Mission doesn't prescribe blame to her brother.
Oh, I know what happened. As soon as she got him off Taris, Lena sunk her claws into Griff but good. She twisted him around her little finger and made him forget all about me.
Mission doesn't hold any animosity for her brother because she doesn't believe Griff acted with malevolence. He was merely influenced by an external force. In this example, that externality is his toxic relationship with Lena. This leads to Mission's second major distinction from Carth, which is her loyalty to individuals rather than groups or ideals. This is best understood in direct contrast to Carth. Carth is a soldier. He steadfastly supports the Republic, but that doesn't extend to trusting people in the Republic, such as yourself or even Bastila. By comparison, Mission trusts individuals and its organizations that she has difficulty connecting with. We see this directly when Mission is confronted with choosing between the Becks and the Vulkars. She resolves this dilemma for herself by concluding she doesn't really have a personal connection with Gadon, so she isn't loyal to either of the swoop gangs. Hopefully this context will reveal how having Mission choose the Becks or the Vulkars are very different but plausible interpretations of her character, even if there is no mechanical difference in the plot. Mission and Carth's response to these thematically similar events add context to their characters. The distinction between them makes each of these characters feel more believable. Betrayal is a major theme in Knights of the Old Republic, and it'll become more pronounced as the game goes on. For now, Mission and Carth are early examples of how this theme will weave its way into each character's story. More importantly, the reason Mission is sticking around is because she wants to find her brother. It's obvious working with your party is Mission's best chance of getting off Taris to find Griff. Before you do any of that though, you'll have to pick up this droid that Canderous referenced. You may have potentially gone to this droid shop earlier in the game while exploring Taris. If you did explore this droid shop, you'll know there are actually 2 droids available for purchase, but if you purchase the more affordable one, this happens. This is a reference to the original Star Wars, where something very similar happens to Luke Skywalker. The droid Canderous has reserved is higher quality. So much higher quality, you'll have to pay 2,000 credits to get it. If you're rolling a dark side main character, you can cut the price in half or even get it for free with enough persuasion, but otherwise you'll need those 2,000 credits. If you've been completing every side quest available to you throughout Taris, it's very likely you already have 2,000 credits. However, if you've been focusing on the main quest, playing a light side hero, and maybe bought some weapons or armor, there's a pretty good chance you won't have enough. You'll have to participate in one or both of the major side quests on Taris to get 2,000 credits. This is a pretty good lesson for KOTOR's design around difficulty. The game has many side quests you can choose to participate in, but if you want to have the best experience, it's ideal to complete every single one of them. This isn't a game like Elder Scrolls or The Witcher where you'll stack up a dozen random quests that have no real narrative significance. Everything in KOTOR is relevant, and the rewards, whether they are credits, gear, or story contributions, are all worth it. On Taris, the two major side quests are bounties and duels. Both of these side quests provide a lot of credits, and we've actually run into them already. The very first NPC you can talk to in the Taris apartments is a woman named Dia. When you meet Dia, she's concerned you're working for a man named Holden, who put a bounty on her head because of an altercation they had at a bar. This is the first reference to the bounty contract side quest, and there's more than just Dia. All the bounties are assigned and paid out by Zax in the Lower City Cantina, but you can run into these individuals before you get there. There are a total of 5 bounties, and each of them pays 300 credits upon completion. If you have high persuasion, you can get an additional 100 credits for each successful persuasion check against Zax. Each bounty contract is distinct from the others, and they convey the different types of resolutions you can accomplish in KOTOR's quest design. The 5 bounties in order of difficulty include Dia, Largo, Matrick, Selvin, and Bendak Starkiller. Dia is the first and easiest bounty. You can actually choose to kill her the moment you meet her. Without officially receiving the bounty contract or talking to Zax, you can straight up murder her in her apartment. Karth will protest, but from where I'm standing, it looks like he did most of the work. If you decide to help Dia, you can resolve her dispute by visiting Holden in the Lower City Cantina and persuading him to retract the bounty.
I've noticed some of the girls around here are giving me the cold shoulder since all this started. Okay, you win. Dia can live.
You can also bribe him 200 credits if you can't persuade him. Dia's quest shows how a lot of problems in KOTOR can be resolved with persuasion skill checks. This is a pretty common resolution tactic across the game, and it's why I recommend first-time players focus on upping their charisma instead of wisdom. Otherwise, you'll come across quests that feel like there are only 2 options: either pass the persuasion check or do the quest wrong. Credits are the most common alternative for a quest you can't resolve otherwise. Largo is a merchant who's in debt to Davik. He's been negligent on his repayment, so Davik had a bounty placed on him. You can meet Largo in the Upper City apartments on the north side. When you first find him, he assumes you're a bounty hunter and offers you 50 credits to keep his location a secret. You can take this offer and gain some dark side points, then also kill him and collect the bounty for potentially 450 credits total. Alternatively, you can pay Largo's debt off by giving him 200 credits, but this obviously prevents you from collecting the 300 credit bounty. If you choose the light side solution for these first 2 bounties, then you've potentially lost 400 credits. Matrick is where the bounties begin to get more interesting. Matrick used to work for the Exchange, but decided he didn't have the stomach for the criminal world, so now he wants out. You can meet him in the Lower City apartments. When you first speak to Matrick, you can suggest he leaves the planet, but he says even if he were to leave successfully, the Exchange would find him, so the only path out of his situation is to fake his own death. Since Matrick has an explosives background, it's plausible he might accidentally blow himself up, but the fireball needs to be big enough to explain why there's no body. You can help Matrick by purchasing a permacret detonator available at the merchant outside the Upper City Cantina. You can actually purchase this detonator before you know what it does. The detonator costs 50 credits, so you'll still gain a net 250 credits if you take this route, but for all the light side solutions, you're still down 150 credits. This quest resolution shows how you can sometimes resolve situations non-lethally, though it may take a bit of goose chasing to accomplish. Of course, you can also choose to kill Matrick the normal way. Selvin is one of 2 bounties paid for by the Taris government. Selvin is a known assassin and mass murderer, so the official authorities have asked for her capture, dead or alive. Zax mentions the Selvin contract came about after she was hired to kill prominent members of the Olgo family. Do we know anyone with the last name Olgo? Would this person have an incentive to fake their own death? You'll find Selvin in the Lower City apartments. This is the most straightforward contract because there's no alternative resolution. You either choose to kill Selvin or not. Because of her mass murderer background, she's the only contract that doesn't give you dark side points. If you try to kill her your first time through the Lower City, you'll only have Carth with you at around level 3. The fight is certainly doable at that level, but it's difficult enough you might be better off coming back later. This is one of the few instances where KOTOR has a difficulty spike that can be overcome by returning at another time. It was once common for RPGs and open world games to have difficulty spikes that require leaving and coming back later, but that design has largely been phased out of the industry. Mainstream gamers may have taken this for granted, but in the industry's early CRPGs, as well as in Dungeons & Dragons in general, it wasn't uncommon for the player to stumble upon a challenge they literally could not complete. There would usually be some narrative elements that indicate the difficulty spike, but over many years of consumer feedback, this type of quest design has fallen out of favor. People playing a game generally assume they can overcome any obstacle that comes in their way. I've already mentioned how KOTOR was designed to be approachable to people who had never played a game before, so it's unsurprising the difficulty is balanced so every challenge can be overcome the minute you get to it. I think this is part of the reason why KOTOR has aged pretty well compared to other RPGs from the same era. The final bounty contract is for a guy named Bendak Starkiller.
I've been watching you on the dueling ring. Not bad for an amateur. I'm tempted to come out of retirement and show you what it's like to do battle against a real champion, but I only fight in death matches. And not too many people are willing to step into the ring knowing they won't ever come out. How about you, stranger? You think you got what it takes?
Bendak is a former competitor of the dueling arena, but he retired after lethal death matches were outlawed. Despite his retirement, he's earned enough bad blood that someone wants him dead. Bendak can be found in the cantina where the dueling arena is, but you won't have the option to kill him until you've made a name for yourself as a duelist, which is a good segue to the other major side quest on Taris. The dueling arena is in the Upper City Cantina, and it gives the player the option to have one-on-one battles with a variety of duelists. We actually talked about the dueling arena a little bit earlier in the video. You can talk to the hut named Ajur to set up duel matches for your character. If you win the duel, you get credits and enhanced renown in the Taris dueling community. These duels are depicted as big spectacles, but even for the early 2000s, the spectacle isn't very convincing. It just looks like a big room and the crowd doesn't even animate. The first few duels are pretty easy. If you're trying to save levels for After Taris, or if you're rolling a scoundrel character, you may have some difficulty with Ice. She's easily the meanest duelist, and it's obvious why.
Let me guess. Now that you're a duelist, you figure we have something in common. Something to chat about, right? Wrong. Just because we're both duelists doesn't mean we're suddenly friends. So give me some space, stranger. I've got nothing more to say to you.
That's right. Ice is British. Otherwise, the first real challenge is Marl. Marl is the only duelist who fights hand-to-hand, so you can't cheese him with grenades like all the other combatants. Whenever I have a character using blasters, I have to game the pathfinding so I can take pot shots every few steps. This isn't what I would call fun, which is why I find it strange one of the most common suggestions for the remake is to expand the dueling arena. In the original game, Taris is the only planet with duels, and you can't continue them after the prologue. I understand why people think more duels would be better, but I think this is a misunderstanding of what makes them so rewarding. The dueling arena is rewarding because it's the first chance the player gets to integrate into the game's world. You can jump into your first duel within 5 minutes of starting Taris, and just like that, you win money, renown, the praise of fans, the ire of your opponents, and you even get a fun nickname, which is obviously so the announcer has a name he can use in voiceover lines.
The fight is over! The mysterious stranger has won!
This is what role-playing games are all about, creating a character and influencing a fictional world. The arena provides a pocket-sized version of that. You're not just doing 1v1 combat encounters, you're becoming the mysterious stranger, the best duelist on Taris. It is undeniable the arena is a rewarding experience, but the novelty would die off real quick after the prologue. The duels on their own are not the appeal, and the renown you'd earn from them is nothing compared to some of the things you accomplish in the main quest After Taris. Not to mention, the story After Taris doesn't really allow for you to moonlight as a galactically famous duelist, but there may be an opportunity for a similar side quest later on. I'll talk about that in a future video. The final duelist available is a Rhodian named Twitch. Twitch uses blasters and a shield, but you can easily cheese him by throwing grenades, which have a much higher hit chance than your typical attack. You can use an ion grenade to cancel his shield, and then a ton of frag grenades until he's dead. After you beat Twitch, Ajur explains explains there's no one left for you to face, unless, of course, you can convince a former duelist to come out of retirement named Bendak Starkiller. Bendak will only consider dueling you if you beat all the other duelists, and even then he'll only duel you in an illegal death match. If you agree to his terms, you'll have to wait for a juror to make arrangements. I think this delay is another example of designers trying to make every challenge surmountable to the player. Bendak's duel is pretty difficult if you don't know what you're doing. Even if you manage to defeat Twitch at level 3, it's unlikely you'll be able to make it through Bendak with beginner's luck. There isn't a defined time on how long it takes to set up the deathmatch, but effectively it's one story beat. If you request the duel and then either rescue Bastila or break in and out of the Sith base, then the deathmatch will be unlocked. Bendak Starkiller is a good time to do a production history lesson. Cue the music. Bendak Starkiller may sound like a familiar name, and that's because the surname Starkiller has been used in a few different places across the Star Wars franchise. The origin of the Starkiller name comes from the first draft of Star Wars. When George Lucas was writing his first draft, he originally based the story around a main character named Anakin Starkiller. Starkiller was written to be a roguish hotshot, not unlike Han Solo. After the first draft of the script, Lucas did a series of edits that reduced Starkiller's role before finally being scrapped altogether. In place of Starkiller, Lucas wrote a new protagonist named Luke Skywalker, who obviously became the star of the franchise. The first name, Anakin, would be reused as the name of Luke's father, whereas the Starkiller surname has shown up in different Star Wars media over the years as a kind of Easter egg for diehard fans of the franchise. Bendak Starkiller was another version of that Easter egg. The Starkiller name was eventually integrated into mainline Star Wars with the release of The Force Unleashed. The main character of that game is a secret apprentice of Darth Vader who takes on the codename Starkiller. I actually like The Force Unleashed, but the main character is pretty forgettable. Personally, whenever I hear Starkiller, I think of this guy from Knights of the Old Republic. If you defeat Bendak, you'll receive 500 credits for winning the duel and another 300 credits for completing the bounty contract. Defeating the first 5 duelists will give you 1,500 credits total. With Bendak, you should have 2,300 credits to purchase Canderous' droid. The other regular bounty contracts can earn you another 1,200 credits, but if you're a light side character, you might only have 450 in total. If for some reason you still don't have enough credits, you can bite the bullet and gain some dark side points to make the droid cheaper, or you can sell equipment at the merchant near the cantina. You should have picked up a ton of blaster pistols and combat armor you won't ever need. Once you have the credits you need, you can purchase the droid from the shop. You'll discover this droid is more than a quest item, but a new companion for the party. I have this pet theory, which I think I first floated back in 2010. Every RPG requires the inclusion of a party member who is completely useless. For Knights of the Old Republic, that party member is this droid. The droid's name is T3M4. It's not literally useless. In fact, it has the highest skill ratings of any character in the game, even more than Mission. The skills are a decent addition, but otherwise I'd argue T3 is a net negative on your experience with the game. I understand the appeal of including a droid character similar to R2-D2, but I think making T3 a party member detracted from the appeal. I think there's a way to integrate T3 into the game without spotlighting how infrequently you utilize it. I'll mention that idea in a future video when it's more relevant. I will say my frustration with T3 was renewed while writing this script, because this droid is what prevents me from writing hyperbolic statements about other party members. For example, I would have liked to have said, Zalbar has the fewest lines of dialogue of all the party members, or Mission's combat potential is probably the worst out of the whole party. But I can't say either of those statements because they're both superseded by T3. T3 doesn't even speak any words, only beeps and noises. So if I'm complaining about lack of dialogue options, then T3 should be my focus. T3's contribution is more than bad, it is incredibly annoying. Every party member in the game can be healed by med packs or by the Jedi heal power, but neither of those work on T3. T3 has to use repair kits, an identical item to med packs, but specifically made for droids. This is consistent with the lore of the universe, but from the gameplay perspective, it is tedious. This is an example of where the game is on the wrong side of the phrase, the player experience is more important than the brand's lore. Personally, I use T3 for exactly 40 seconds per playthrough. That's the time it takes to walk from the droid shop to the Sith base, watch the cutscene where it unlocks the door, then switch T3 out of my party forever. For this video, I dabbled with keeping a droid in my party, but I couldn't stand it for more than a few minutes. If you think I'm missing something about T3's appeal, feel free to make the case in the comments, but I doubt he has any real fans. When the community is polled about their favorite party members, T3 is right at the bottom. Thankfully, you can switch your party before you enter the Sith base. base. Once you're inside, you'll come across the first instance in the game where your persuasion and computer skill can make a tangible impact on the challenge of your task. You'll be intercepted by a receptionist who questions what you're doing in the base. You can either persuade or bribe her not to press the alarm button, which will spare you a combat encounter with a handful of Sith soldiers in an adjacent room. You can also use the receptionist's computer to look at security cameras throughout the complex, and sometimes you can manipulate the contents of the room. For example, the Sith base has a kind of mini-boss in the form of a giant droid blocking the elevator you need to use to progress. If you have enough computer spikes, you can deactivate the droid's shields. Doing this will make the battle significantly easier. The computer spikes have no value beyond these difficulty reduction tactics, so you might as well use them when you have them. The Sith base is another dungeon environment where you're incentivized to fight or engage with everything you come across. You should be getting a feel of how these dungeons unfold. Most of the rooms have some common gear and resources, but there are one or two unique rooms that have something novel to check out. The first of these in the Sith base is the Armory. It's a locked door, but you can unlock it either through the computer at the front or through a surprisingly low security skill check. My character with 1 point in security opened this door without a problem. The Armory has some decent weapons you can use for your blaster companions or sell for credits. The other interesting room is in the back, where you find an imprisoned Duros alien. This is actually the same alien who helped you at the very beginning of Taris. He explains he was arrested for moving the bodies of the Sith you attacked in your first confrontation. I like this detail because it's an example of the writers considering the reality of the world beyond the game mechanics. A lot of games hand-wave explanations for how the world functions, but KOTOR does a decent job trying to make all the events believable. Obviously, if you killed Sith soldiers during a Sith lockdown, that would draw a lot of attention to your character. The Duros explains the reason you avoided that attention isn't because computers in 2003 couldn't handle enough memory storage to keep bodies from disappearing, but rather because this guy helped you out. This background makes you invested in the NPC's well-being. He's not a faceless side quest opportunity. This is a person you've met before, and they have a history of helping you. The Duros explains you can release him if you successfully solve the panel puzzle on the opposing wall. You'll see there are 5 panels set to different values of red and green. If you set all the panels to red, you'll set him free. If you set them all to green, the cage will implement an electric shock and execute him. This puzzle is similar to the datapad mini-quests we've come across already. It relies on basic problem solving outside of combat mechanics, and it's a nice change of pace. The challenge of this puzzle is any panel you flip will automatically flip each adjacent panel. You can flip the panels on each end to free him. Just past these panels is a hallway that leads to the elevator with the droid mini-boss. If you've deactivated the droid's shields, this fight is relatively simple. After dealing with the droid, you can take the elevator upstairs to the actual dungeon boss, the Sith Governor.
Who dares to break my meditation? You will pay for interrupting my... Wait. I sense the Force is strong with you. Very strong. Who would have thought a Force adept could be found on this insignificant planet? But your talent is no match for a disciple of the dark side.
The Sith Governor may not have a lightsaber, but he is the first Force user you'll fight in the game. Despite being 3 versus 1, this guy is the most deadly opponent in the entire prologue. His main threat is the stun ability he'll use frequently throughout the fight. This can be a real nuisance. Even when I have a build I consider overpowered, this guy always manages to kill 1 or 2 of my party members by stun locking them to death. There's no strategy to overcoming this other than hoping the dice rolls end up in your favor. If your character has high wisdom, then you're more likely to resist the stun attacks. You might be thinking, if that's true, why didn't I get more wisdom in the character creator? The reason is because you won't have low wisdom for much longer, so this is really the only fight that's significantly harder as a result. If you're having trouble with this fight, you can backtrack to swap your party members at the Sith base entrance. When the Governor does go down, there's no cutscene, but you do get access to the Sith codes. There's also a locker box with 500 credits and an item called Strength Gauntlets. These gauntlets add +1 strength to the wearer, which is a pretty fantastic item in terms of gear, especially this early in the game. I personally give these to Bastila or my own character. With the Sith codes, you have everything you need from the Sith base and you can head back out. Nothing dramatic will happen on your way out, but you do have to walk back through the base and all of Taris to get to the Lower City Cantina. I think the game could have just teleported me to the Cantina, but I suppose this gives you an opportunity to tie up any loose ends before you leave Taris for good. good. Once you talk to Canderous in the Lower City Cantina, you'll initiate the plan to steal the Ebon Hawk. If it isn't already clear, the Ebon Hawk is owned by Davik Kang, the leader of the Exchange and Canderous's employer. The plan is Canderous is going to pitch you as a new enforcer for Davik. Davik will then bring you into his estate for an interview, and while you're being vetted, you and Canderous will steal the ship. If you do have any loose ends on Taris, now is the time to finish them, because you won't be able to return to Taris again afterward. Taris's inaccessibility will become immediately apparent. You'll get a cutscene showing Darth Malak overlooking Taris from the Sith fleet. This is an interesting placement for the cutscene because other than the quick reference in the opening crawl, this is the first time Darth Malak has made an appearance in the game at all.
The search for Bastila is taking too long. We cannot risk her escaping Taris. Destroy the entire planet.
The entire planet, Lord Malak? But there are billions of people on Taris. We'd be slaughtering countless innocent civilians, not to mention our own men still on the surface.
Your predecessor once made the mistake of questioning my orders, Admiral. Surely you are not so foolish as to make the same mistake.
Malak is concerned the Sith are taking too long to find Bastila, so to prevent her potential escape, he orders the Sith fleet to bomb Taris. Players may conflate bomb Taris with the Death Star's annihilation of Alderaan, but there's no Death Star in the Old Republic. Taris isn't getting fireballed out of existence, it's getting bombed to the point of devastation. This act reasserts Darth Malak is the true antagonist of Knights of the Old Republic. You've been spending a lot of time whacking Swoop Gang members, but the real big bad is the man so evil he's willing to initiate a pseudo-genocide simply because he's impatient. This is the first real evil thing Malak does, and it's important to distinguish his character as someone irredeemably evil. After all, the main antagonist of the first two Star Wars trilogies is a character whose descent into evil is meant to be tragic, and the conclusion of that character's story is a kind of redemption. By comparison, when the introduction to a character features them annihilating a planet full of people, it's pretty clear redemption is not in the cards. The placement of this cutscene is smart because it accomplishes three narrative objectives. First, it increases the stakes of the player's mission. Your ploy to steal the ship now has a time limit, which continues the sense of urgency that's present throughout the prologue. Second, the announcement of Taris's destruction signals to the player they're nearly done with the prologue. Personally, I think Taris has three natural stopping points for first-time players. These are spots where you can hit save and come back later. The other 2 points are once you get mission in the Undercity, and once again when you save Bastila from the swoop race. If you're playing this game in 1 to 2 hour sessions, both of those spots make sense to take a break. By comparison, it is unlikely anyone stops once you get to Davik's estate, and that's because this cutscene indicates you're almost done. Finally, the bombing of Taris avoids a common pitfall of RPG storytelling by integrating the events of the prologue into the rest of the story. Let me explain that last point because it's sometimes missed by casual players. In Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, it's common to begin stories with a prologue like Taris. These prologue sequences let players experiment with their characters, and it lets the DM filter out annoying players without retconning their contributions on the main quest. These sequences have a functional value, which is why they appear in a lot of RPG video games. Other prologue sequences include Vault 101 in Fallout 3, Eden Prime in Mass Effect, or White Orchid in Witcher 3. The challenge is making the prologue feel important after it's over. Sometimes a designer concludes a prologue sequence without considering how it might devastate a player's morale when they realize everything they accomplished has no impact on the actual story. Taris is the prologue sequence for Knights of the Old Republic, and BioWare manages to get the best of both worlds with how the events unfold. Instead of Taris being some starter world no one ever refers to again, it's a location that was destroyed by the main antagonist. Taris's destruction provides a plausible explanation for why some things aren't relevant beyond the prologue, such as your dueling identity as the mysterious stranger. But the reason for this is integrated into the story. Taris isn't forgotten about, it was destroyed. It was destroyed because of you and your party, specifically Bastila. You have a direct connection to the fate of that world, and that reality will impact current party members and other characters you'll meet in the future. After the cutscene with Malak, your character will be introduced to Davik, and you'll gain some insight on the inner politics of the criminal organization, the Exchange.
I see you've brought someone with you. Most intriguing, if I do say so myself. You usually travel alone.
It's not like you to take on partners, Canderous. You're getting soft.
Watch yourself, Callow. You may be the newest Cath Hound in the pack, but you aren't top dog yet.
Enough. I won't have my top 2 men killing each other. That's not good business.
It's apparent Davik relies on Canderous and Calo Nord in equal measure, and they've developed a rivalry as a result. You'll also hear Davik's voice, which I personally find to be one of the most ridiculous performances in the game. There's nothing wrong with his accent or delivery, but for a Star Wars game, it feels very goofy for the leader of a crime organization to sound like an extra from Goodfellas. I guess one of the charms of early 2000s video game design was the industry's lack of standards. These days, voice actors are recognized by the Screen Actors Guild. Similar to Hollywood, games can use union talent, which ensures higher quality performances, but also restricts some of the wackier past methods of getting voice talent. For example, the original StarCraft had all unit voiceovers done by designers on the game. You know, now that I'm reading this, I think StarCraft is probably an outlier example. Video games were infamous for terrible voice acting for a very long time, so I probably just have rose-colored glasses.
We've managed to avoid drowning. Good job.
It just seems like so much of the industry today is sterile and unremarkable. I'd almost prefer a uniquely terrible performance over a totally forgettable one, which means I think I changed my mind. Davik's voice is actually okay. You can chat with Davik a bit about your past accomplishments, but eventually he'll say he needs to run a background check on you. This will take an indefinite amount of time, and he instructs you not to leave your quarters. Real quick, this isn't about KOTOR at all, but what is it with old people and background checks? I worked for a guy who requested a background check on every person we hired, including 20-year-olds with no life experience. A background check will only bring up if you've been in prison or declared bankruptcy. Even if a person is in prison for declaring bankruptcy, that doesn't mean that they can't do the job of answering phones at the front desk. It's not like a background check is an objective referral of someone's ability to be employed. Anyway, you obviously don't plan to sit around while the background check discovers your Pazak habit put you into bankruptcy. Davik's estate is another dungeon environment, but it has more non-lethal interactions than the past locations like the Vulkar or Sith base. Davik references the slave quarters, and this is the closest to non-combat area to explore. You can request a massage from one of the slaves, and this interaction is one of the few instances where KOTOR shows its age as a game released in 2003. The game was written with what we now refer to as heteronormative assumptions, which was not a mainstream concept in the 2000s. It means your character can only get a massage from slaves of the opposite sex. If you try to get one from the same sex, you'll be directed to talk to the other one.
Welcome to the slave quarters, fair mistress. I mean no disrespect, but perhaps one of the male slaves could serve your needs better.
This is one of the things I find fascinating about art in general. It tends to reflect the culture of when it was made, even if it's not intentional. I don't think anyone at BioWare thought twice about making massages exclusive to heterosexual assumptions, but today it stands out as different from the current culture. I'm not someone who has a strong opinion about this one way or another, but I find this example is unique. Most of the time, I would consider the story of Knights of the Old Republic to be timeless. It feels like a narrative that will be relevant for a long time, but this is one of the few examples that dates the game as something that was made in a prior era. But who knows? Maybe this part of the video will show its own age in 20 years, like when we finally abolish human biology, or return to monkey, or whatever other nightmare the future has in store for us. These slave quarters are also where I gained a new appreciation for the wealth of content in this game. In all the years I've played and replayed KOTOR, apparently I never took mission to Davik's estate until I made this video. So while recording this footage, I got this dialogue exchange, which I've never seen before.
Wow. This guy's gorgeous. Davik sure knows how to pick him.
Very bold of BioWare to suggest teenagers have sexuality. Your objective in Davik's estate is to get the passcode to the hangar and get on the Ebon Hawk. You can do this with enough computer spikes, but otherwise you need to find the pilot of the Ebon Hawk who will give you the codes. It turns out the pilot is being tortured for some reason, and he'll give you the codes just for saving him from the aptly named torture droid. If you're mainlining the story objective, you can get in and out of Davik's estate in under 10 minutes. The pilot isn't far from where you start, and you can skip all the other rooms. This is more representative of the design of dungeon environments in Dungeons & Dragons. There's always a lot of optional content you don't need to engage with. But as I mentioned previously, the game is at its best when you engage with everything available to you. Most of the rooms in Davik's estate are other crime-adjacent guests, such as a corrupt Teresian noble who has a whopping 500 credits in his locker box. The risk of exploring these rooms is the guests will try to call the guards. You can persuade them not to, but even if you get dragged into combat, it's only 3 enemies and they're not that difficult to defeat. Other than these guests, there are 2 unique unique rooms in Davik's estate. One is the production room for a drug called Spice. This may feel out of place, because this room is the only reference to drugs in the entire game. Well, other than the second floor of the Volker base, but that content was cut from the main release. This Spice room in Davik's estate poses an interesting challenge for whoever is in charge of the remake. Knights of the Old Republic is sometimes criticized for being too cartoonish with its depiction of evil, and I know some fans would prefer if the evil parts of the game were written to be more realistic. The remake could add some grime to the game's tone if they restored this subplot of an intergalactic drug trade, but I don't know if that would make the game better. It would just be different. I think you can argue it would be different in a way that's not faithful to the original vision of KOTOR. It's not an accident all the references to Spice as a drug were removed from the original release. This room is called a Spice production room, but there's nothing here that explains Spice is a drug. This could just as well be a Dune reference instead of an attempt to introduce drugs into Star Wars. We could debate if drugs would match the tone of KOTOR, but I think we should get further into the game than the prologue before having a conversation about the game's tone. The other interesting location in Davik's estate is a trophy room with the heads of different creatures on the wall. You'll find a datapad belonging to Calo Nord, which details how he killed a Rancor. I'm not going to go through the effort to confirm this, but the passage in this datapad feels like it was taken from that Boba Fett The Fight to Survive book. That book came out in 2002, and I remember reading it when I was 10 years old. Maybe I'm conflating the two, but I've always thought this datapad read oddly familiar. This trophy room adds to the mystique of Calo Nord and contributes to his popularity as a uniquely competent killer. However, if you've played KOTOR before, the heads on these walls are pretty silly. All of these animals are from other parts of the game, and almost all of them are docile, non-violent creatures. Like, is Calo Nord really proud he went to Dantooine to kill what is effectively a deer? I doubt it. Whenever you choose to leave the estate, you'll run into another janky 2000s era mechanic. The passcode you get from the pilot needs to be punched into a computer. This means if you go to the hangar door, it won't open. There is a computer nearby, but this abstraction doesn't add a lot to the game. I suppose the passcode means you can leave the hangar with enough computer skill rather than finding the pilot. This would hypothetically provide a way to leave Davik's estate without getting into combat, but this is a pointless alternative because the estate concludes with a boss combat encounter. Maybe if using computer spikes meant you could leave the estate without the final boss encounter, that would make the option more compelling. But it's important to the story to have this final confrontation, so I don't know if that's a viable alternative. Once you get inside the hangar, you'll see the Sith bombardment of the planet has already begun. Davik and Calo Nord are trying to escape, but they see your party and deduce you're attempting to betray them. Calo Nord has apparently wanted to kill Canderous for some time, so this is as good as a time as any to have a final encounter. This combat encounter can be incredibly difficult, but luckily you can cheese it. For what it's worth, you can cheese a lot of fights in KOTOR by using grenades, but I only ever do that for the Starkiller duel and this fight in the hangar. There's some other challenging fights throughout the game, but I usually try to play it the way it was intended. For this fight, you have to fight Davik and Calo Nord at the same time, but once one of them goes down, the fight is over. Davik has some of the best armor in the game and begins the fight by activating an incredibly powerful shield. This is an excellent reason to ignore him entirely and focus on Calo Nord. You can toss a few grenades at Calo, and once his health hits 50%, you'll trigger a cutscene of the hangar collapsing.
If I'm going down, I'm taking all of you with me. This thermal detonator will blow us all to bits. Damn those Sith! They'll bring this whole hangar down around our ears!
The debris will prevent you from looting Calo Nord's body, but you can pick up Davik's armor, visor, and shield. This is some of the best loot in the first half of the game. After that, you board the Ebon Hawk and fly out of there. You'll get another cutscene showing Malak committing to Terrace's annihilation, and your ship will be pursued by Sith fighters, which Karth will announce.
Incoming fighters!
Quickly!
I don't know why, but that awkward pause after his line delivery always makes me laugh. You'll get launched into a fighter minigame. This minigame is inoffensive by itself, but it reappears many times throughout the rest of the game. It gets tiresome because you can't proactively attack the fighters. You have to wait for them to start their attack run on you, then shoot them down. Sometimes the ships fly just outside where you can aim, which is also pretty annoying. The other problem is the trail of your blaster fire is so insanely long you have to lead your shots by a few inches to land hits reliably. It's not an intuitive or rewarding minigame, so it's universally disliked by the community, but mostly it's inoffensive. After this fighter sequence, you're finally off of Terrace and on your way to the Jedi Council on Dantooine. So you've gotten past the part of the game everyone pretends to hate. I want to make a defense for Terrace, but first let me mention the major change I would recommend for the remake. I've already mentioned some of the smaller nitpicks, such as the inaccessibility of clunky mechanics or how droids aren't super useful. But the biggest change I'd make is removing the Terrace Undercity and rewriting Mission's involvement in the story. I have two problems with how Mission is currently used. The first is her introduction. You can meet her at Javiar's Cantina, but really she joins your party in the Undercity. The Undercity feels off-brand for Star Wars, and all the content there is redundant or bad. The community really doesn't like the Undercity, so I think there's plenty of reason to cut it entirely. If you do cut it, then you have to move Mission's introduction somewhere else. The second problem I have with Mission's current implementation is her reason for joining your party is lame. Currently, she only tags along because Zalbar swears a life debt to you.
I guess this means you're stuck with me, too. Wherever Big Z goes, I'm going. I almost lost him once. It's not gonna happen again.
Mission is basically along for the ride, but has no personal attachment to your story. I think this makes her a passive character, which isn't consistent with her personality. This is in addition to the critique that Zalbar's life debt is given to you for what I would consider very low stakes. All of these problems can be solved at once. Instead of introducing Mission in the Undercity, the game could introduce Mission at the Hidden Backspace when you meet Gadon for the first time. When you approach Gadon, he could be mid-conversation with Mission as she futilely tries to convince him to send people to save Zalbar. We already know Gadon frequently reprimands Mission for going to the Undercity because it's too dangerous. Instead of being told about this, we could see Gadon say this to Mission. This would establish the main conflict Mission has with the Becks and herself. She's young and immature, but wants to be taken seriously. This would also show Mission's relationship with the Becks, rather than having Candon's comment on how they treat her act as the only reference of her relationship to them. The player can see Mission argue with Gadon, and the scene would conclude with Mission storming off. When the player talks to Gadon, instead of having him act like a benevolent crime lord, he could act more like a gang leader and say Bastla's well-being isn't his problem. He could confirm there is a swoop race and Bastla is the prize, but he doesn't need to offer to help you. A gang leader wants what's best for his gang, so he would probably prefer a member of the Becks win the prize. Your conversation with Gadon goes nowhere, but when you leave the Beck's base, you're approached by Mission. Mission overheard your debacle and wants to make you an offer. She can submit herself to the swoop race and win the tournament for you, but there's a catch. She needs the accelerator from the Vulcar base to ensure her victory, and she'll only help you if you save Zalbar first. It may seem oddly bold for a teenager to work with two strangers, but that's consistent with her character. She is supposed to be a reckless teenager, so why not introduce her with a reckless plan to help you? This deal accomplishes all the narrative beats with Mission up through the Undercity, so you can cut that area and go straight to the sewers from the lower city. This is a more compelling introduction to Mission because her character has investment in your plan to win the swoop race. I think this alternative makes Mission a stronger character who chooses to be part of your story, rather than merely tagging along for a contrived reason. This rewrite would also remove the game's need to make Gadon a likable gang member, which makes the portrayal of criminals more realistic without altering the tone too much. It would also make the choice between siding with the Becks or the Vulcars more compelling because it would further focus the choice on how it influences Mission. Does she continue to trust the Becks, or does she decide to look after herself? This rewrite would give Mission investment in your story through the swoop race, but if Zalbar hasn't sworn a life debt, what's keeping these two around after you save Bastila? That's actually pretty easy to resolve. After the swoop race, the leader of the Vulcars is killed by your party, and if we're using the alternative rewrite, that also means Gadon submitted his own Beck racer who just lost the tournament to Mission. That's assuming you didn't already kill Gadon by choosing to work with Candon. This means you, and everyone associated with you, would be a persona non grata for both the Vulcars and the Becks. Mission could conclude it's probably best for her safety if she tries to leave Terrace. If you've spoken to Mission about her family while you're on Terrace, you'll know she has another reason to get off the planet. The plan to leave Terrace happens immediately after the swoop race when you speak with Canderous. This means Mission is now invested through to the end of the Terrace prologue. But what about afterward, when you're off the planet? That's also an easy answer. As you fly away from Terrace, Mission will see her home planet was destroyed by Darth Malak, the villain you're already trying to defeat. When you talk to Mission after Terrace, it's clear she's deeply affected by this event. I should be clear, this is already the case in the actual game. It doesn't need to be added. This means, once again, Mission has a reason to commit to helping you because she wants revenge for the destruction of her home. If that isn't good enough, this is also where I would move Zalbar's life debt. As he watches Terrace get annihilated, it would be clear he would literally be be dead if he didn't join your party. This is distinct from the enslavement from the Gamorreans, which seems like it could have lasted forever, but it doesn't have the same certainty of doom as watching a planet get bombed into oblivion. Since you are the reason Zalbar escaped Taris, this is the reason why he swears a life debt to you. Without you, he would have died in the bombing. Honestly, it might make more sense for Zalbar to swear his life debt to Mission. Functionally, Mission is already committed to getting revenge for Taris, so if Big Z swears the debt to her, then he becomes the passive character who's along for the ride, and I think that's more consistent with his character. This would result in both of them joining the party through the same narrative tool. It's just flipped in a way that makes more sense. However, Zalbar swearing a life debt to you is significant for at least 2 story beats later in the game, so maybe it's best to keep the debt to you even if it doesn't make complete sense. It's still better than the sewers alternative. I think these changes would make the inclusion of this duo more believable, and it would strengthen Mission's character. These changes also improve the game without adding more content. It streamlines and strengthens what's already there. That's the only foundational change I would make to Taris, beyond the obvious quality of life improvements. Taris is a great prologue, but I know a lot of people don't like it. People don't like Taris because you're not a Jedi, and with the exception of Bastila, you don't get to use a lightsaber or force powers. I understand that complaint, but if Taris weren't part of the story, Knights of the Old Republic would be a worse game. I think what people misunderstand about Taris, and Star Wars in general, is Jedi and lightsabers are only cool when they're unique. Any storyteller who knows what they're doing knows you need to vary the emotional experience of a story to be successful. You can't be high-octane action all the time because the audience adapts to that and it gets boring. You might be able to think of different media that appears to have constant action, such as John Wick, Crank, or The Raid, but even these examples have an ebb and flow. Action movies specifically use a concept I refer to as escalation. This is where there are consistent action set pieces, but each one has progressively higher stakes to keep it exciting. All those action films I referenced handle escalation very well, and some variant of that concept exists for all stories, not just action films. Imagine a romance novel where the couple gets together at the very beginning, then spends the rest of the story being nice to each other and reaffirming their love. That sounds like a wonderful life, but it is a boring story. You need some courting before the first kiss feels exciting. Star Wars is the same way. If you lead with the Jedi stuff, then there's no sense of importance for becoming a Jedi. If you fill the game with Jedi powers in combat, then you have to steadily ramp up your abilities or else you risk boring the player. For a longer game, such as a BioWare RPG, that risk becomes far more likely. Honestly, KOTOR already gets dangerously close to making the magical powers of the Jedi feel tedious by the end of the game. The only reason I find this game so easy to replay is because the Taris prologue does a magnificent job resetting your expectations for the Star Wars universe. It gives you a taste of life without Jedi powers, and it does an incredible job instilling the sense of wonder that makes becoming a Jedi so rewarding. Taris not only does a great job setting up the world of Star Wars, but it's also an incredibly faithful depiction of the Star Wars atmosphere and tone. This goes back to the Rancor's appearance in the sewers of Taris. Fans of Star Wars will know the Rancor first appears in Return of the Jedi at Jabba's palace. This is one of the locations from the original trilogy that really conveys the confluence of aesthetics for Star Wars. Jabba's palace is where you can find smugglers like Han Solo, or bounty hunters like Boba Fett. These are the lowlifes in the undercurrent of society. They all gather in the den of a crime lord who surrounds himself with shifty company and trashy indulgences. It may be difficult to remember now, but for many decades, this was the atmosphere of Star Wars. The rugged outback of Tatooine was where the rebels called home. It was only among the Empire where tightly dressed officers roamed pristine surfaces, and even those places had rougher spots. For 30 years, Star Wars was defined by rough environments and scrappy protagonists, but this became muted with the prequels and subsequent media. A lot of Star Wars stuff focuses on high society, like the politics in populated cities, or beautiful vistas on exotic planets. It looks nice, but it feels sterile. It lacks the feeling of the untamed wilderness portrayed in the original trilogy. And for what it's worth, some of the more popular new Star Wars media has returned to the atmosphere of the original trilogy. An atmosphere where you could believe there were Minox in asteroids, or Wampas in caves, or a Sarlacc pit in the desert. There have been attempts to have fantastical monsters in the newer films, but in my experience, all of those examples feel goofy.
There's always a bigger fish.
They feel goofy because they're being inserted in a more polished world, one that doesn't have a place for them. Most of Knights of the Old Republic matches the new aesthetic of Star Wars. Jedis in robes contemplating morality questions in pristine environments environments or touristy locales. But one of the best things about KOTOR is it starts the story in the same atmosphere where the franchise began. Taris has all the elements of a place like Jabba's palace. It has junkrats like Mission Veo, it has bounty hunters like Calo Nord and Canderous Ordo, it has cantinas with Twi'leks dancing to space jazz, it has low-life gangs and illegal swoop racing, and yes, it even has a Rancor. Taris grounds this Star Wars story in the franchise's roots. The roots where the story connected with anyone who's ever felt stuck and daydreamed of being part of something grander. The dream of leaving behind an unremarkable origin to join a galactic adventure where you'll team up with memorable companions, uncover a hidden power, and test the limits of your abilities. Much like Luke Skywalker's story, we see by the end of Taris that the cost of committing to an adventure is the loss of your old life. Quite literally, the planet where your story begins is gone. There is no going back. You're on this path now, and all you can do is see where it goes. It's with this mix of fear and excitement you venture toward your destiny. Knights of the Old Republic can only accomplish that unique feeling because of the Taris prologue. I know a lot of people think the remake would be better if they trimmed Taris or got rid of it, but I think BioWare got it right. Taris is one of the best things about Knights of the Old Republic, and what's incredible about this game is it only gets better from here. But what happens next will have to be for another video. I had plans to complete this project as one long video, but I've never made anything this long before, and I'm not certain if anyone cares to watch it. If you liked this video, I would appreciate if you took the time to leave a comment so I know you watched it. It took me roughly 200 hours to make this video. That's a conservative estimate of writing the script, editing it, recording it, getting footage, and putting it all together in Adobe Premiere. All that happened in the past 3 months and doesn't include the years I've spent playing this game a dozen times over the past 2 decades. I think that's a good metric for how long it will take for me to make a follow-up video. I'd like to do another video on Dantooine, Tatooine, Kashyyyk, and Manaan, and then a final video on the story climax, Korriban, and the endgame. It might be possible that all this can be fit into one additional video, but I guess I'll see. These videos will probably take another 200 hours, which could be 3 to 6 months depending on my situation. Okay, I'm recording this months later, so it doesn't sound the same, but I just want to correct myself here. This video took maybe 5 months to complete. I worked on it almost exclusively in May, June, and half of July, and then I got a job at the end of July, but then the last part of this process, which is me editing the video, took maybe 7 times as long because I went from working on it every day to working on it on one day of the weekend, maybe. If any of that interests you, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel and consider supporting me on Patreon. If you don't like Patreon or don't want to do a monthly subscription, I also take one-time donations through Ko-fi.com. You can donate $1 one time and it would still be a great help. But more than anything, I hope you'll leave a comment if you liked the video. I make videos because I enjoy it. The reward for me is the creation process, but hearing people value my work is a nice bonus. Thanks for watching, and hopefully we can continue the story of Knights of the Old Republic in the next video.